I've had it with these mother freaking partisans on this mother father internet. Okay? This is just the latest video, and I figured I'd finally go ahead, dive in, and show just how biased each side is and how ridiculous a lot of these things are. Okay. So, since this is the reasonable party, we're going to try to be reasonable and see if any of this makes sense. Let's begin. Oh look, Patreon. Support me. Alright, so this goes on for a while, for a long time, and just when you think it's going to stop, it just keeps going. But I'll wait until the actual substance comes on.
Socialism has never worked. Don't you just love it when left with...
Okay, first of all, I thought that this was David Pakman in 2011 making a video. That's what I really thought in the beginning, because it's his voice and then it goes to this voice. It's kind of like this voice, and he's kind of being sarcastic, I thought. Listen to this.
Wing ideologues, incensed about the fact that no one is buying into their shitty debunked ideas, have to resort to trying to revise basic historical facts. Whether it's Venezuela magically no longer being socialist after...
So here I just thought this was David Pakman talking up Venezuela in 2011, and I thought, hey, maybe David Pakman being sarcastic was not the best call. Maybe he was wrong. Turns out it's not David Pakman. It's a guy who's trying to debunk David Pakman, who's usually very careful with his words. Let's see how that goes.
A decade and a half of left-wing intellectuals such as Noam Chomsky pointing to it as an example of socialism being a viable economic model, and the fact that the majority of their economy is directly nationalized and controlled by the government, and the parts of the economy that aren't nationalized and controlled by the government are controlled by government-established communal councils where workers directly control how businesses are managed. This seems to be the preferred method of damage control for the ideological left, and thanks to the internet, it's all coming to an end for them. Because the only reason their propaganda could be so prominent for the longest time is because they controlled all the outlets for where people could get their information.
Okay, I really thought this was just a parody, and I thought eventually David Pakman, who's talking like this, will eventually say, oh, but this is just nonsense, right? But no, this is an actual real video, and he's actually saying that the left control all the media, okay? Never mind the fact that Fox News was launched by a billionaire mogul who had the New York Post and then launched a revolution in biased news, which then MSNBC and others tried to copy. Never mind the fact that the right wing has so many media people and talking heads, like, I don't know, Rush Limbaugh, for example, Mark Levin, to name a few, Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, I don't know. Yeah, I guess finally, there is, a right-wing thing. No, they weren't bashing Obama for 8 years. They weren't telling you that they're coming for your guns. They weren't telling you that global warming is a hoax, that evolution shouldn't be taught in schools. They weren't saying any of that because right-wing media doesn't exist. You see, mainstream media is leftist only. Fox News, the highest rated cable network, is not mainstream, you see.
However, now information via the internet has been decentralized in a very similar manner to how blockchain is going to decentralize the economy. Now,
well, that's pretty cool. And by the way, blockchain is basically people owning just what they own. It's not Facebook, for example, or Google owning the whole network. It's people owning their own little thing. Wow, I wonder if owning your own little thing is an example of socialism? I don't know, because the word socialism has been pretty much overused and completely stretched by everybody on the left and on the right. So it basically means people not owning extreme concentrations of wealth at this point, which is not the real definition or the original definition, but it seems to be the new definition. And by that definition, the blockchain is actually kind of socialist.
Controlling the narrative is nearly impossible. So let's listen to how AIDS Uyghur here tries to explain to us.
AIDS Uyghur? What is that? I have no idea, but you're making fun of his smile? Can I make fun of your voice? Go ahead.
why trying to create wealth by dividing wealth and expecting that to lead to economic prosperity isn't completely fucking retarded.
It's become a truism repeated by right-wingers and people who just don't know much about political theory.
Oh, so it's gonna be one of those now, is it? You say socialism doesn't work? Well, you're just a dumb right-winger.
Okay, no, I guess socialism doesn't work is repeated by people across the political spectrum, including those on the left that constantly advocate more socialist policies or more socialist economics. No, I believe it's people on the right side of the political spectrum that typically say socialism doesn't work, which is an oversimplification because A, they don't define what socialism means. It may as well mean anything they don't like because clearly Medicare works and they say hands off my Medicare. What is that if not a single payer system for the elderly? Or, I don't know, they want vouchers for public schools. What is that if not a single payer system for education? I don't know. There's tons of things that are actually pretty centrally planned. The interstate highway system, for example, military, you can go on and on. Even our oil subsidies. I mean, if you really want choice, why don't you have electric cars? In electric cars, I have a choice in what I put in my car. So I can maybe generate energy with nuclear fusion one day, or geothermal, or hydro, or nuclear fission, or whatever we have now. Okay? I can use solar, but no, we have to lock ourselves into fossil fuels. Is that choice? I don't know. That's pretty centrally planned to me, it seems. But anyway, let's continue. Oh, by the way, corporations are pretty centrally planned too. I mean, by definition, they're top-down, centrally planned. And 51% of all workers in America work for them. Okay? And the kids are put in public school so that the two parents can work for them. It used to be one parent. Now both parents work for corporations. They don't have time to watch their kids, so they put them in public schools. Of course, the kids have to sit down and shut up for about 8 to 10 hours a day while the parents work for corporations. So the kids are taught one day they will work for the corporations. That's not central planning at all. Hey, by the way, the school system itself is kind of centrally planned. And if the kids can't sit still for 8 to 10 hours a day, well, then they're medicated with ADHD medication, which is methamphetamines. But of course, Finland, with better schools and better achievement and only 3 or 4 hours a day for the kids, that's socialism. That's not central planning, right? Okay, or for example, the adults. Okay, so now there's an opioid epidemic. I'm sure they're very happy about that. And antidepressants. I think 1 in 3 middle-aged women has antidepressants now. It's hard to have it all, isn't it? Having kids and working for corporations. But of course, what about the elderly? They're not left out. Well, at least they're not left out because their kids don't actually take care of them because they have to work for corporations. So they put them in nursing homes. And of course, they're medicated as well. Because, you know, the whole population needs to be medicated at this point. But of course, it was the Russians at the USSR who were drinking all the vodka and feeling not very happy. But Americans, they're the happiest people in the world working for these non-centrally planned corporations. Continue, please.
Stop spreading your Fox News propagandas, you stupid rube. He says that we don't know anything about political theory, and then he pans over to Bernie Sanders as an example of a socialist.
Wait, so is Bernie Sanders a socialist or not? I personally think he's a social democrat. Well, actually, David Pakman is also a social democrat. The difference between socialism and social democracy is huge, okay? Socialism is about collective ownership of the means of production. Social democracy is basically capitalism with redistribution of wealth so that people could have public parks, they could have roads, and also safety nets, like a universal health insurance, for example. And we're going to talk about this, but let's continue with the actual author of this video.
Oh, man. Well, first of all, there's...
By the way, what's with these cartoon characters now that these guys do? They're like, obviously have a right-wing mindset, but somehow these cartoon characters make it so cute, and I don't even know, are these wolves? I mean, there's these other guys that have, like, mice? I don't know. But I guess they don't want to show their face, and I totally understand. When I show my face, I have a beard, I don't have a beard. I mean, that's kind of my thing. This guy, He has a white beard. It's animated.
The obvious problem that you can't use rhetoric and ideas of how you think something should be, or as you described it, political theory, as a metric to observe human action. Also, what about the economic calculation problem?
Okay, what about it? Let's see what it is.
You know, without a price ratio, how can producers determine how to properly allocate their resources? Or the...
Okay, so without prices, how can producers allocate their resources? First of all, in social democracy, as I said, there is capitalism. And so producers compete with each other and they set their prices any way they want. But in other examples, sometimes the prices are actually not the main thing of how to allocate resources. For example, when you have a national health care system, let's say it's completely nationalized, and there is even no competition among doctors. Okay. People sometimes allocate stuff based on need. If this guy is freaking dying, okay, and he needs immediate help, perhaps the plastic surgery of the guy next to him can wait. So they prioritize by need. Elective surgeries take a back seat to actually saving lives. There's also preventative checkups and other things that help in general increase public health. And of course, if people have safety nets, right, and they have some money, then they can actually afford to take risks and not worry about some kind of hospital bill or grandma getting in the hospital. Just think about Medicare in the United States, okay? I mean, even Trump recently, I think last year, praised Australia's healthcare system, saying it's better than the United States. It's literally called Medicare, and it is for all Australians. It's literally Medicare for all. Continue.
The incentive problem. Without a profit incentive, how can you even have a functioning economy?
Oh, how indeed can you do anything without seeking monetary rewards? Well, let's see. Okay, well, there's Wikipedia. I wonder how it got built up. I'm sure those people all got paid. Wait a second. No, that was Britannica, the greatest example of capitalism in encyclopedias. It was sold door to door. Those profits were redistributed top down to writers. Somehow Britannica is not really heard of anymore because we have Wikipedia. What happened? Okay, well, I see. What about AOL? AOL was a typical example of a company where you could literally it had so much money it sent CDs to everybody because it could afford to, because once you got on, you would pay it every hour you were on. Okay, you got 1,000 free hours, 2,000 free hours, and then you had to pay. That's an example of capitalism and top-down employment. AOL called the shots. If you wanted, you could work for AOL and you could make AOL keyword blah, blah, blah. If you had a company, you hoped that AOL would let you place your little store in there and have AOL keyword Facebook. But guess what? The web came along, right? And the web was permissionless. And nobody got paid. There was no rent seekers. Look at the trillions of dollars that it led to, an explosion of wealth. But somehow there was no AOL to permission and to give permission to start your own website. And that's how we got Facebook. That's how we got Amazon and Google and everything else that you see on the web, including Etsy and smaller things, Twitter. They could have never built something on top of someone else's platform like AOL. Okay, permissionless. They're not making any money. What about all the open source software in the world? What about Linux? Okay, Linux runs most of the server software. What about WordPress? WordPress basically runs 30% of all blogs. Do you really want to write your blog on a certain site? Here's an example of central planning. Corporations. You have this on Google's property, YouTube, which was sold to Google for $1.65 billion. Two guys spent 1 year building something that Google bought because it worked and was more popular than Google Video. Well, that's what you use. And if they want to kick you out, they can. But if there was something open source, like the web, I guarantee you that more people could build more wealth on it, and they have. Whether it's the web disrupting AOL, whether it's Wikipedia disrupting Britannica, whether it's Linux running on far more types of computers than Windows ever did, and so forth and so on, whether it's every browser and everything that we use. No, people do things If they have a safety net, they study science. Scientists, okay? Scientists did not make a huge profit, okay? Many people contributed to society, like the polio vaccine, without making a huge profit. But in pharma today, of course, you need the intellectual property system because, of course, without capitalism, why would anybody want to invent cures for diseases? Why would anybody in this next door in the Department of Physics want to build on someone else's ideas for free without paying them rent? Of course, capitalism is the only way that people would ever organize or do anything. Open source doesn't exist. Science doesn't exist. Wikipedia, the web, none of it exists according to this author. Okay, continue.
Yes, some people can do with a gift-based exchange or mutual aid, but
some people, okay, continue.
Just like with bartering, most people are not satisfied with trading commodities for a payment which they don't desire in return.
Yes, correct. Most people want to survive. If there's anything they want to do, it's that. They want to eat, they want to have a roof over their head, and now they got pretty spoiled, in the 21st century. They want the water to come to their house. They want that water to be clean and safe to drink, okay? The Romans were happy enough for the water to use aqueducts to come to public bathhouses, and they used to shit in those bathhouses. So we're doing pretty well, and I would say that technology, not necessarily capitalism, but technology is what led to what we have today. Science and technology. Some of that could be centrally planned by governments of states or by governments of corporations, okay? And some of it could be done by mom and pop shops. The interstate highway system would probably not have been built by individual mom and pop shops. China would probably not have built entire frickin' cities and millions of miles of road in 20 years and would not have raised wages by 25x if it was all just mom and pop shops. So, some things are built, big things like going to the moon or giant interstate highway systems, etc., or your internet infrastructure maybe, that one's debatable, are built by giant corporations, some of which form cartels like your telecommunications industry. Okay, and others are done, like consumer goods, like sneakers, like food, like whatever, are done by an open market economy. So it's not either or. Please stop this partisan nonsense bullcrap.
Socialism has not, cannot, and will not ever be a viable means of basing your society's economy.
Okay, well, you would need to actually define socialism in order to use it in a sentence, okay? Here are some right-wing people who are totally stretching the word socialism to mean pretty much anything I don't like.
Because of these basic economic problems, which socialists either baselessly reject or are willfully ignorant of.
I have addressed both problems, the incentive problem as well as the price problem. Sometimes you just allocate things based on need. Need has come to be pretty obvious and predictable. You can usually tell, not 99 and 100% of the time, but most of the time, if a dude's gonna die in the emergency room versus someone who can pretty much wait a little while. You could tell that. You could tell if a guy's gonna die from hunger or is malnourished. And so it's kind of egregious when you have a society that prioritizes, let's say, a plastic surgery and lets people die because the plastic surgery guy had more money. In fact, in 1985, the COBRA bill was exactly this. Most people know COBRA as just, hey, you are fired from your job, so you get COBRA insurance. But in fact, if you look it up in the COBRA bill, there was a major provision. See, back then, there was a big scandal. People used to be turned away from hospitals for inability to pay, and then they would die on the way to the next hospital. So Congress decided to pass and put this in the COBRA, the omnibus bill. Okay, and what they did is essentially they said that hospitals have to treat you regardless of ability to pay, and then later seek payment. So some people that can't afford to pay, guess what? It falls on the society. Those costs are socialized. Socialized medicine. Oh my goodness, saves lives. Oh, so terrible. Prioritizes based on need. Okay, and what's the other one? The incentive problem. I've pretty much said that science, open source software, and collaborations of all kinds happen when people have enough money to survive and eat. And of course, they can also take care of their children, they can also take care of their parents, they can also love each other and research philosophy and religion, they can take courses, they can do all those things and sometimes contribute more to society if they have safety nets. Oh my goodness, they got that money for free. That's not fair. Doofus, you live in the 21st century. You got a lot of stuff for free. The people that contributed the stuff you use today are dead. You're not compensating them, but they, all of them throughout history, built up the science and technology, which leads to the longevity and the low child mortality and the everything that you tout. That's technology and science, okay? And not all of it was done with a free market system. Some of it was done by guilds, and some of it was done by commissions from the government, and others were done by tribesmen, etc., etc. In fact, empires used to actually disseminate things. Like when we say China invented paper, or they invented gunpowder, or whatever, that means someone in China invented it, and China is a giant freaking empire or federation, okay, that basically had a lot of provinces, and the Mongol Empire was like that too. And so that's what allowed everyone to speak the same language, travel the same roads, and have peace instead of fighting each other, okay, needlessly tribal warfare. And so they were able to focus their energy on inventing stuff and collaborating. So yes, a lot of these things were commissioned by the emperor or commissioned by schools, which were pretty much financed by military spending and other things. Even such centralized things as empires were helpful to humanity. If you look at Africa, there weren't a lot of big empires there, certainly nothing approaching the size of Rome or Carthage or the Alexander's Empire or the Mongol Empire or anything. Carthage was in North Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, you had what? The Ashanti Empire, Congo. I mean, there's not a lot. And of course, by the time they did arise, the Europeans came to plunder them for ivory and for other things like De Beers diamonds. And then you wonder, hey, how come they're malnourished and how come they don't have the resources we have? Doofus, okay, they use gunpowder. They read guns, germs, and steel, okay? In the Americas, people had socialism. They were living collectively in tribes, many of them. The Aztec Empire was literally, like many of these empires, people worked for the government, or they built pyramids or whatever. In Egypt, this happened, okay? Anyway, let's continue and see how this goes on.
That isn't rhetoric. That's a fact, unless, of course, you can refute these
Yes, that's what I'm doing in this video. That's not rhetoric. This is fact. Look, facts are things that you state that are in reality. Saying people can't address your ideology is not a fact, okay? A fact is something like, let's measure the carbon concentration in the atmosphere around the world, and let's see if it's been going up tremendously, shooting up with the human dumping of carbon in the atmosphere. That is a fact, okay? A fact is something you can actually measure and have other people agree with you. This is not a fact. This is basically more ideology. Continue.
Economic problems. Not even talking about the commodity price going way the fuck up because of government monopolization and lack of incentive, or the ethics of forcing people into labor just for the socialist economy.
Forcing people into labor. Let's see, how do you force someone to do something? You could, as the anarcho-capitalist would say, put a gun to their head. But of course, that's still a choice. You could get shot, that's a choice, or you could do something. But of course, why wouldn't you want to get shot? Because you don't want to die. Guess what else people don't want to do? They don't want to run out of food and die. They don't want to get some condition which is easily treatable, but left untreated, they die. So people essentially, many Americans, are living paycheck to paycheck and basically on the verge of homelessness if their landlord kicks them out. 1/3 of all Americans, okay? I have a question about this. That's Americans. I'm not even talking about working Americans, okay? Just 1/3 of Americans. Now here's the thing. Are they not being forced to work? Well, I mean, you could just, die or maybe run out of food. Maybe you could move into a homeless shelter. Maybe you could live in a communal housing. Maybe you could live like they lived 500 years ago. Hey, peasants used to work for a landlord, okay? Hey, in Japan, for example, the corporations still partner with your landlord. If you don't pay your rent, the corporation will pay it and scold you. So things and society can be highly stratified. And this is feudalism in some way. Pick your corporation and work for it. But of course, it's much worse than feudalism now, because whereas your grandfather used to work for the corporation and have years of loyalty from the corporation, work decades, support the family on one paycheck, and then retire, today, oh yeah, and have a pension, of course. Today, a 2-year stint is pretty much the norm. And then there's the gig economy and a race to the bottom with Uber drivers and all this other stuff that you can do. TaskRabbit, great. That's how you're going to support yourself, I guess, these days. That's not even feudalism. That's literally just like jumping from feudal lord to feudal lord. That's basically like the tramp in Charlie Chaplin, where he is always looking for work everywhere. Oh yeah, the dude's not forced to work. I mean, all you need is just air, water, and maybe food, right? I mean, by today's standards, that's a shitty life, but actually that is all you need. So if you have clean food and water, and you can kind of get a bed somewhere and everything in communal housing, like maybe a hostel, yeah, maybe that's fine. But yes, people are forced to work, man, because they have standards in the 21st century. They want that clean water to come to their house, okay? In Flint, Michigan, they want that. People want food, so they get food stamps, okay? They get safety nets. And universal health insurance is pretty much the norm in every civilized country. But hey, what do we know? What do they know? I mean, we're the best. They have death panels. Continue.
Simply explain how you can have a socialist society which is capable of sustaining itself, where large portions of the population don't starve to death or meet some other grisly fate due to...
Okay, I mean, you have to define socialism. Social democracies is basically, they're all over the world. Canada, Australia, pretty much all of Europe, the Nordic countries. And we haven't even got to David Pakman clips yet. Dude, okay. So I'm guessing social democracy is not socialism? I don't even know. But let's say socialism is socialism, okay? Collective ownership of the means of production, okay? Well, corporations are collectively owned, right? The public stock market, the stockholders own collectively the corporations, and they actually, they vote for the board members, right? I mean, not every stockholder has enough to actually care, but the stockholders technically govern the corporation by electing a board, which then appoints a CEO, and the CEO appoints all the other unelected bureaucrats that run the corporation. Whatever happens, the corporation tries to make money, but it also does other things. That's collective ownership by the public, by the stockholders. And let's see, the means of production. Well, I would say most of the stuff that's produced in America is produced by corporations, whether it's Nike or Starbucks or McDonald's or Google. You're using stuff that corporations are producing. Funny how you are posting on YouTube and Facebook the most centralized, centrally planned properties on the internet, and you're talking about how central planning doesn't work and everyone starves. Are you kidding me? Continue.
To a lack of available resources, or where the government or other organization which centrally plans distribution doesn't collapse into itself.
Okay, did Facebook collapse into itself? It centrally plans its entire network and tons of, I don't know, it's the biggest network probably with a billion or 2 billion people. Google, does it collapse on itself? Or does it make moonshots, it has more money than it knows what to do with, and it just completely decides what to invest in next, the self-driving cars, or even bringing broadband to cities and other crap? Come on, dude. Look, these economies of scale also have benefits. They don't just have drawbacks, okay? A government could actually fund something like the interstate highway system. Does it always pay off? Do their investments always pay off? No. Solyndra. No, they don't always pay off. VCs don't always make bets. In fact, many VCs make crappy bets. The top VCs make pretty good bets because they're very famous, and all the big startups, the most famous startups, want to get them eventually. So it's kind of like free money for them. But come on, man. Look, even the pharma industry is heavily subsidized by the public money, which they never give back to the public, of course. If somebody invents a drug, they're simply snapped up by big pharma, and then intellectual property is used in order to go after people who build similar drugs. Yeah, that's capitalism using big government to go after people because they declare intellectual property to be property, individual property, because you can own ideas. That's an example of capitalism. Has that been better than Wikipedia and science in the other fields? Has that been better for society? We're running out of antibiotics, okay? Why? Because it's not profitable to do more antibiotics under this system. But can we let other countries do it? No, because they would be infringing on our intellectual property. We pay the most for our own drugs that we develop and but we get the best for it, right? No, other countries that get the same drugs for cheaper, and we bear all the R&D cost. How is that better for us? Why do we hog all the R&D costs for ourselves? Oh, because intellectual property is going to lead to it. Bull crap, okay? I mean, that's actually one of the biggest cost drivers of healthcare in the United States. And that's just that is just healthcare. We talk about banking, telecom industry, everything else. You're talking about capitalism that is essentially the government gives out licenses to these corporations, let's say, for the broadband spectrum. Who's going to use what frequencies? Ham radio operators, well, they're old news. We need private ownership of the spectrum. Okay, well, that's what you get then. You get private ownership. And some of it is good. You're using it today. Okay? So you're literally hypocritically posting this on the most centralized areas of the internet as opposed to your own site. And you're talking about how central planning doesn't work. Do tell.
Due to the fact it can't manage its own resources.
Google can't manage, or Facebook can't manage its own resources. China has just raised, I think in 20 years, 500 million people out of poverty. Wages have risen 25 times in 20 years. That's not 2x or 4x, that's 25x. People have moved into cities. But what do we say? Oh, central planning never works. Look at this ghost city that hasn't been filled yet. Oh, that's crazy. Meanwhile, in the United States, 11% of all real estate is owned by landlords who are not willing to lease it out because they're looking and holding out for a better deal. 11% of all real estate lies vacant. But that's never compared to ghost cities. Look, these are two different economic systems. Some of it is centrally planned, some is not. We lived in a mixed economy. But it's not fair to say that allocation is perfect under a market system. It's totally not perfect under other systems. Some big things are done and centrally planned. And around that, around the interstate highway system, you have trucking, you have McDonald's and malls and logistics and transportation that has grown up around it, okay? So you get to the next step in evolution and manufacturing. Sometimes it takes a government to provide the initial outlays and the investment to get to that next step, and that's what governments do.
Does it mean cherry pick some random data, like you love to do, and don't explain yourself? I want you to give me an explanation from an economic standpoint of how socialism is a viable model, then provide data or historical evidence which accommodates your claim, and by viable...
Well, let's see. I've pretty much been doing exactly that throughout this video. I hope you're not bored listening to me. I mean, there's been 4 minutes of this guy and probably way more of me, but that's how much I've been... I haven't even scratched the surface and telling you pretty much specific examples of how central planning, including this very site, have operated, okay? I am not a fan of central planning. I personally believe that things should be decentralized, but I'm not foolishly completely ignoring the concept of economies of scale, okay? Amazon has tons of patents. Amazon has tons of workers. Apple has tons of patents and workers. Amazon and Apple have built up tremendous supply chains and infrastructure that they can leverage for each one of their projects. I'm not even talking about Google and other tech companies, but literally every company has giant processes that they have tested and worked versus the average mom and pop startup that just started, or a pizzeria or something like that. Yes, it's easier to get rich when you're already rich, just like it's easier when you're in a poker game with a large stack to get an even larger stack versus a guy that could lose at any time because you can afford to take more risks. Google has pretty much shuttered Reader and Google Plus recently, which I think was a mistake. tons of projects that can just throw away and totally afford to do that, okay, and take chances. Facebook has done it. Apple has done it. Microsoft, what do you got? The Zune. You got all these failures. Microsoft is still around as one of the biggest companies in the world. It's centrally planned, okay? So again, I've given tons of examples. I would like to get some acknowledgement about that. Thank you.
It simply works well enough to sustain the bare minimum of what an economy needs before society begins to break down and famines start to occur.
We're getting to David Pakman finally. I hope you see how laughable, in the face of everything I just said, this is. Corporations literally are centrally planned giant organizations, and that's where we get most of our means of production, okay? And they happen to be collectively owned, most of them. Bloomberg LP is not collectively owned. It makes the Bloomberg terminal. But like McDonald's, it's collectively owned. It's no longer owned by two brothers and a real estate guy who decided to run around them and make McDonald's into the biggest real estate company in the world. No, it's owned by the public. Anybody can buy a share. It's heavily regulated by the government. It is literally part of a system that is top-down, heavily regulated, and at the same time, anyone in the public can buy a share. How much more is it the collective ownership of the means of production than the public stock market? But it's also capitalist. Socialism and capitalism are not diametric opposites. They can coexist because socialism is just what?
Defined by a textbook, socialism is the collective ownership of a society's means of production.
Thank you, David Pakman. That is the definition of socialism. Socialism is not social safety nets. That's social democracy. But again, if this is socialism, then even the public stock market of the largest corporations in America, owned by the public, okay, are an example of socialism, while also being an example of capitalism, because these countries work with capital, okay, and they have large amounts of it. Like Apple, that has tons of cash that it doesn't know what to do with, and sometimes invests in overseas companies like Didi in China, a driving company that's like Uber. So yes, we don't know. Maybe these corporations decide to stash their money overseas. How does that help Americans? I don't know. But they pay zero in taxes. Amazon's paid zero in taxes, I think. They made $13 billion in profit. So yes, this is top-down in this country, and corporations have existed for a very long time. Again, I'm in favor of decentralizing things, but let's not pretend that central planning is always worse and economies of scale don't exist. Of course they exist. That's why things take a long time to disrupt AOL or Facebook or Google or IBM or anything, okay? It takes time for an upstart and a bunch of upstarts to finally, like ants, go ahead and devour the one behemoth or whatever. Okay, so David Pakman, please take the floor.
Means of production could be non-human resources used to produce things of economic value, like...
See how, by the way, David Pakman's very precise. He says non-human resources. He could have just said resources, and then you think, oh, but what about human resources? So yes, non-human resources like tractors, for example, are used to produce value. Now, farmers used to plant crops. Yeah? Farmers used to plant crops, and they used oxen. They're non-human resources, I guess, animals, right? And they used to help plow the field and put the things in the ground. Today, thankfully, we even have drones that will plant 1,000 trees in an hour, and they fly around and they shoot bullets into the ground, and we could actually use that to reforest the earth. But back to the point, these farmers were disrupted by technology. And this technology came around the 20s and 30s, and that actually helped bring about the Great Depression, okay? Joseph Stiglitz talks about this, how before the Great Depression, 20% of Americans worked on farm-related jobs, okay? People used to do this. Here we got 1, 2, 3 people. There used to be tons of people here in these fields, right? And there still are in other countries. So what happens is that in some countries. So what happens is this used to be full of people working in the farm. Then we automated this, okay? So when you have that, you have overproduction with less people. So now the crops were rotting in the fields, and the farmers basically competed in a race to the bottom, so who could plant more next year so they can make the same amount of money that they always used to make. And of course they planted more and more, and they would totally deplete all the nutrients in the soil. And then you got the dust bowl, which literally all this dust soil would just blow away because literally nothing would be growing to hold it down. And we have similar effects now in Africa, where tons of land is turning into desert. Look up Google desertification on the planet. It's like 1/3 of farmland, okay, is now turning into deserts. Now maybe the Chinese, with their centrally planned science, whatever, will be able to finally grow things in the desert. There are now things happening around that. But we're talking about the Great Depression. Almost is an example of people leaving the farms and having to go to the cities, and it takes 10 years to build up the manufacturing and the factories and the jobs. And you can read actual novels like John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, where people would actually migrate to the cities where they would be homeless and there would be very few jobs at the time, and they would not have any money. So what happens? So the farmer gets laid off, he doesn't have any money, so he can't spend the money at the store, and then the store clerk doesn't get the money, so he can't spend the money, and so forth and so on. People default on loans. Loans are given by banks. So the money supply shrinks because most of that money supply was actually bank money that was lent out. 1/3 of banks around the country fail, and the Federal Reserve doesn't step in. The centrally planned Federal Reserve System does not step in to bail out the banks and save the banks like they did in 2008. And every economist, even Milton Friedman blamed the Fed, saying, given that it exists, okay, given the fact that the Fed exists, and it was put together by bankers, essentially, it should have bailed them out. So central planning failed to centrally plan when it was time to do it. But the Great Depression is an example of essentially what is Schumpeter has he coined the term creative destruction, where capitalism invents these things and people get laid off, there's no people here, and then they don't make any money anymore. So we're running out of things for people to do. They used to do farming, we don't need that. They used to do mining things from the ground. I guess we still need miners for coal. I mean, I don't know. Yes. Then the manufacturing sector, there's a 3-sector theory of economy. The manufacturing sector, people used to manufacture stuff. In China, Foxconn used to manufacture with people for Apple. Now it uses robots. So if you look at Detroit, people used to work on cars. They moved from here to the factories and they had cars. But now they can't work on those cars because the robots work on the cars. You don't need the people to do it. The people that want to compete with a robot, like John Henry in the fictional story or whatever, okay, they get less money all the time. Okay? So, and they work harder than ever. So they're in a race to the bottom with a robot that is being constantly worked on by a centrally planned corporation with economies of scale. And we're talking about, how is this sustainable? This is not sustainable. People will need money to survive, and there will be a growing unemployed class of Uber drivers that were eliminated by self-driving cars, by truck drivers that were eliminated by self-driving trucks, by McDonald's workers that were eliminated because they asked for a $15 hour wage, and McDonald's said, we're going to put money into R&D and replace you guys with kiosks. By unions that drove corporations to outsource a lot of stuff to other countries. So outsourcing and automation will eventually deplete the demand for people's jobs. It may not happen tomorrow, but we need to be prepared for that kind of demand shock because it is real. And not everybody can become a rocket scientist, coder, or whatever will finally be the job that will remain. Some people will need an unconditional basic income, or at least some sort of safety net like food stamps or maybe a universal health insurance system. So we can already have that in place. The question is only how big it should be, and should it grow elastically with the unemployed class? I don't know. Maybe the unemployed class should just be employed to do crazy jobs. Milton Friedman made fun of this by saying they should just dig holes and fill them back in. Anyway, I've been talking a long time. Let's continue David Pakman.
Real estate or farmland, natural resources, equipment, buildings, infrastructure, roads, and collective ownership of these things, meaning workers or the public own them.
by the way, he was very clear in defining it. Again, I just want to get the definition as it is from beginning to end.
Human resources used to produce things of economic value like real estate or farmland, natural resources, equipment, buildings, infrastructure, roads, and collective ownership of these things, meaning workers or the public own them.
I don't like the idea of the last thing because he hasn't defined the word own them. And that's actually what anarcho-capitalists and others don't really define either. The word own actually should be defined in terms of other words. For example, ownership implies control. You can control things about that thing. Here's how I define ownership. Ownership is the monopoly right to exclude others from use of a resource. If you own a lake, you can exclude others from drinking from it, from peeing into it, from polluting it, or using it in any way. If you own an idea, you can restrict others from using that idea in their own ideas, in their own thing, without paying you a rent, which I personally think is a bit of a ridiculous notion and is not very helpful, but that's an example of intellectual property. So that is what property and ownership means. When you get down to it, it is an exclusive monopoly right to exclude others from the use of a resource. Sometimes it's not nice to exclude Newton from using mathematics. He can do great things with it. Sometimes it's not nice to exclude someone, I don't know, like Petri from inventing what is it, the Petri dish? Sorry. Or like, for example, Galileo from using science to actually study the world. It's not nice sometimes to exclude Pasteur from discovering bacteria. So I'm just saying that people should be maybe freely be able to use ideas. And if that's the case, perhaps people should, to some degree, be freely able to use public parks or air or water. I know, it's crazy. But today, people use water and they all drink. Somehow in Honduras, there was privatization of water. It became a big scandal. And you could see how people reacted. Even though the corporation may have actually allocated the water better, but there's this idea that everybody needs water to survive. They can't spend a few days without it. So yes, public access to certain amounts, minimal amounts of things to survive are pretty good. And in some areas like software and ideas, it's pretty much free, marginal cost to make a copy of a file or an idea or whatever, Wikipedia. And so in that case, maybe it doesn't even make sense to create artificial scarcity in those areas. So yes, collective ownership is, to me, not defined here, because private ownership is the monopoly right to exclude others. Collective ownership would say that you can exclude others. But of course, I would say collective ownership is about not excluding others. I wouldn't use the word necessarily collective ownership when I talk about everybody is allowed to breathe air. Are they collectively owning the air on the planet? No, they're just not excluding each other from it. No one's collectively owning Wikipedia. No one is collectively owning open source software that you can easily copy, or science. No one's collectively owning that. That is free access. Okay? Collective ownership is basically excluding others, but you have, instead of one person owning it, you have many people owning it, like the public stock market, where corporations are owned by a large group of people and governed in certain ways with bylaws and boards and CEOs running the show.
Which fundamentally has two problems, the first of which being that it's impossible to define which properties are collectively owned in a socialist society because
okay, well, if you have a large number of people, or even just a group of people, and they have a voting system that governs a certain company, like an employee-owned company or a corporation owned by shareholders who have other things to do than work for that corporation. They could, just be completely financially dependent and still own a share. They can collectively govern it. Disneyland and Disney World is an entire city that is governed top-down by a corporation that is collectively owned by shareholders who don't reside in Disney World. And next door is a city that is collectively governed by its own citizens and that democratically vote in power by the people that actually live in that city. And that is why Disneyland workers have to beg Disneyland to pay, and Bernie Sanders has to get them to raise the minimum wage. I guess that's the way to do it these days. But in the other city, the people who run the city can democratically elect their mayor, and City Hall can actually elect bureaucrats to run things, and that's the way we do it today. I think in the future we'll use technology to run a lot of these things. But again, I'm saying that collective ownership is simply collective management of the thing. Like a co-op is collectively managed by its tenants, okay? It has a board. It doesn't allow everybody in, so it excludes people. You can't just walk in and get an apartment. But it's collectively owned. So yes, you can define these things. It's pretty obvious.
A property's use is defined subjectively. In other words, what can be used as personal property for you can be used as a means of making profit for me.
Well, yes, if I personally own a giant building and I decide to rent it out, then I am a landlord. If, however, this is owned by a corporation like a co-op where everybody has shares and they have a board and they have a no pets policy and they have all these other things and they get breaks like the Mitchell-Lama tax breaks in New York City, which was pretty successful and is low-cost housing to this day, pretty much the lowest cost housing. Yes, those are collectively owned. So guess what? The same building could be owned by one landlord, top down, calling the shots to everybody, firing everybody, or it could be collectively owned. And the city that the building is located in could be collectively managed and have a law that says you can't just raise the rent arbitrarily. You have to have a cap on how much you raise the rent, because it's just hard for poor people to go up and leave anytime that you kick them out because, hey, your lease expired. That they need to have some stability, and you can only raise the rent by 10% or something. Rent control. Okay, so that's collective ownership, and people are represented. And some of the tenants usually tends to be that the lower income people are more numerous, and therefore they get some representation, because if money was the only signal, they wouldn't speak very much. That's why in Africa, a lot of people are suffering from malaria, but not a lot of research goes there. Bill Gates said this. He said a lot of research goes to your baldness, okay, but not necessarily malaria. I don't know how true that statement is anymore, but it illustrates kind of the point that if money is the only thing, if money was the only thing, okay, I could go into a village of poor people and literally buy the courts and then rape everybody or take their money or do whatever I want. I rented the courts for a few days. Nobody can do anything to me because they can't bring suit, because they can only afford their own courts, and I bought those courts. And if money is really the only signal, integrity is not, democracy is not, voting is not, then yeah, the courts will just do whatever I say because they're privately owned, top down. I tell them, listen, whatever I do is by definition legal. I go ahead, steal everyone's money, and I make more money at the end of this operation, then I go to another city and do this. You think this is an exaggeration, this is hypothetical. No, this literally happened throughout history. Marauders would simply amass a larger army, and then they would go and plunder a village. That is literally what happened throughout history, and that could happen today with Coca-Cola or Nestle buys a lake somewhere where it's just super cheap to buy, and whoever will finally sell the lake to you, maybe if it was privately owned, it's even easier. Just sell off or intimidate a couple people. There you go. You got the lake now. You can use the lake, drain the lake, and the people that actually have to live there are not really represented or consulted in this decision, right? And you can also pollute. You can have nuclear waste, and only the people who are rich can say, not in my backyard. Not in my backyard. But over there, I'm too tired of hearing about these refugees that want to come to our country, overrun with gangs, overrun with poverty. Oh, Honduras, oh, you have a drought. Oh, that's too bad for you. Just don't get into our country. We're pretty rich compared to the rest of the world, and that's our attitude towards the rest of humanity. And then you have people that have a lot of money. Maybe that could be some of their attitude. Some of those people could be like, I want a gate around my area, and I don't care. The Great Depression's happening, just don't get into my gated community. I would like to live in peace with a lot of money. So you don't get people represented democratically. You don't have them having a voice, if the only thing is money, you can have a lot of injustice. You could literally buy justice in that case. How would you prevent that? Actually, it's up to you to tell me, how would an anarcho-capitalist system prevent this from happening? People buying the courts, then looting everybody, and then renting the courts to the next rich guy who wants to do something. Literally, justice would be for sale. Everything would be for sale. And values sometimes are different than monetary profit. Continue.
A house is a popular example of personal property in a socialist society by socialists. Well, what if I were to rent out my attic? Then I'm using my house to obtain profit, which...
Okay, well, I don't know how autistic this person is in the way he speaks, but, I mean, think about it. For rent, okay, I'm going to use Karl Marx as example. I don't think Karl Marx has the monopoly on common sense or has the best ideas in economics, but Karl Marx pretty much noted a lot of the contradictions in capitalism. I know capitalism is kind of a religion among a lot of people in America. Not all. Most Americans are actually pretty leftist. They believe Medicare. They like Medicare. They like Social Security. They like roads. They like public schools, maybe, which I think public schools could be actually disrupted eventually. Flip the classroom. But my point is, a lot of Americans seem to think that capitalism is like this religion you can't criticize. You can't say the words, capitalism has problems. Capitalism can eat itself sometimes. Maybe it can result in negative externalities, like factory farms. Hey, we've got billions of people we need to feed. Let's sell hamburgers for $1. Oh, let's put all the cows in one place. Hey, let's get the cows so fat that they'll just give milk all the time. Let's breed those kinds of cows. Hey, let's separate chickens into two kinds. One makes a lot of eggs, and the other is good for meat. And the boys of the type that lays eggs, well, we don't really need so many boys, so let's just shred them, okay? And then you have factory farms. Well, who cares about those animals, right? That live in cages and can't even move. Okay, well, maybe you're not a person that thinks animals should have rights or really their welfare is any of your concern. But if you're even that kind of person, okay, first of all, you could see that the antibiotics that are fed to these animals, because they're in confined conditions and they infect each other, these antibiotics serve to basically inoculate the bacteria that used to respond to these antibiotics. And now these bacteria become super bacteria, and guess who they infect? Yes, humans. So, let's see, an externality of capitalism. In order for the hamburger to be cheaper, we need to put the animals in a confined space, feed them antibiotics so they get larger, they don't infect each other. We chop off the beaks of the little chickens, so they don't peck each other in the little confined spaces. Then, after all that horrific treatment of animals, we also decide to just overuse the antibiotics because, hey, why not? It's not like I'm going to be around when the superbugs come and diseases that used to be treatable are no longer treatable because, again, the capitalist system of inventing antibiotics just hasn't kept up. But hey, capitalism is the best we got, right? So central planning and is stupid, and intellectual property is going to be the best way to produce more antibiotics. I don't think so, but okay. I mean, let's see what happens. I'm not really that looking forward to the superbugs and the lack of antibiotics, but that's just one example of externalities of capitalism. I could go on. Anyway, so Karl Marx, he said there's a use value of a property. That's when you actually use it and you live in it. And then there is the market value, which is the use value plus a speculative value. So maybe the first floor you use, and maybe you don't even use anything, and you just sit on this house, like 11% of all properties. And you basically just wait until it really goes up in price, and you really don't want to futz around with wear and tear by tenants who might not pay you or whatever. I don't know. I mean, that's a lot of people. I'm not going to judge their decision. It seems kind of silly to me to leave something just vacant rather than making money from it. So I wonder how much of their decision is their own versus but people would actually pay them if they dropped the price, right? But anyways, so yes, everything has a use value. You mentioned cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency has a use value, that's utility tokens. And then people speculate on these utility tokens like Bitcoin or whatever because they think it will go up in price. So really, most of the bubbles in the price is and the housing bubble, okay, with the flipping of the houses, whatever, were actually done not by the people living in them, not by the ninja loans, the no income, no asset, no job, so-called loans that conservatives blame Clinton for forcing banks to lend to people, which I don't see any specific examples of that, but okay, maybe they relaxed the standards. But you know who they did lend to is the people who took the classes, I remember in 2004 and 5, flip your house, learn to flip your house, fix it up, and then sell it for more. Those speculators drove up the house prices, and they took the loans. They could afford to take the loans. And then, of course, at some point, the music stopped. The musical chairs stopped, right? So, yes, this happens with every bubble. And that bubble is mostly formed by speculation. There's been bubbles in bread, where Goldman Sachs would corner the market in bread. A bank, a centrally planned bank, would try to drive up prices in bread in order to make a profit. And they're not even eating the bread. Or in steel, they tried to do this as well. It doesn't always work. Usually it spectacularly backfires. But again, it's not always all roses when capitalists get involved. It's not always roses when speculators get involved. And so, some people want to have Glass-Steagall acts where depositors' money is, let's say, governed one way and speculative money is governed some other way. So there's some stability. There's no perfect system, but people try. People recognize that capitalism does have drawbacks, and I've mentioned some of them. And I'm not saying socialism has no drawbacks. In fact, socialism and capitalism can coexist, like in the stock market. But this is a stupid sort of capitalism totally good, socialism totally bad dichotomy. So I've been mostly defending collective ownership, or at least explaining that it is not incapable of producing wealth. It is not incapable of being productive for society. It is literally what people have done in tribes, whether Native American tribes or Highland tribes of Scotland or anything. People have done this throughout history, so it clearly worked, okay? So don't worship the current system of private ownership as the only way and the best way to do everything, and one hammer for every nail, and everybody else is stupid. This is literally what today has become. People just completely... So it's become a bit of a religion, like Islam in Saudi Arabia, where you can't criticize Islam. You can't go and say, well, I don't think Muhammad was actually inspired, and I think he was just a dude with, maybe he had epilepsy. I mean, people have epilepsy. They have things, they see dreams. You could say that about St. Paul. Hey, maybe St. Paul had epilepsy also. I mean, he's kind of like Muhammad. He saw dreams. He saw visions. You don't believe in him. Why don't you believe in that? And you could tell the Christians the same. It's like, yes, you could say these things, but people are going to look at you and be like, get out. You're messing with our religious system. That's kind of the immune system that the Americans have. Not the Americans, many Americans have, who believe capitalism is what built this country and nothing else. There was no collective ownership. There was no government. There was no programs for anybody. Maybe that was true. Maybe capitalism did actually contribute so much. But of course, this country also had a lot of resources. It was protected by 2 oceans, and they didn't fight each other. The states didn't fight each other because they had basically the same language and the same religion and the same background. They did kind of exterminate a lot of the natives, though, and they took their land, and there was 30 million people living here, and now they live on little reservations. But hey, that's a small detail. We kind of took all that land, manifest destiny, okay, and then we had the Monroe Doctrine of the whole hemisphere basically is under our protection, right? And we pretty much went ahead and engineered coups, in the United States did, in South America, because we didn't like socialism, right? So Nicaragua is getting a socialist movement. Hey, let's fund the Contras and the Iran-Contra affair. Hey, that's not arming terrorists at all. That's just freedom fighters because capitalism. And hey, the Panama Canal, that definitely brought a lot of wealth. But of course, America needs unfettered access to it. Panama didn't exist, okay? So what happens if Panama doesn't exist and there's Colombia right next to it? So what can you do? Hey, how about you get a revolution and then people form Panama? And then you can build the Panama Canal after they are your puppet state, right? Or you could have, for example, Manuel Noriega being trained In the School of the Americas, literally called the School of the Americas, they trained dictators and strongmen to take over countries. Okay, like Manuel Noriega in Panama, took over, and he's our guy, except later he wasn't our guy anymore, and we arrested him, but not before. We controlled everything about the Panama Canal, and we made, obviously it's important to get ships through that, but maybe there's other ways with, people actually not being your puppet state. Hey, capitalism wants government to help it as well, okay? So you've got the United Fruit Company, okay? The United Fruit Company in South America, for example, I think it was in Guatemala, they wanted special favors from the government. Of course, no other company would get those favors, but hey, that was under the American protection because it was an American company. So we sent in the boys, we basically got the country overthrown, we got made a coup. Even Iran now we have, it used to be called Persia. There's a whole history of why it's called Iran, because of the Aryan race and Hitler. They kind of liked the idea of an Aryan race, which actually comes from Iran. But anyways, it's called Iran. They had a democracy, a short-lived democracy, which, but BP, British Petroleum, was extracting oil there. So of course, they wanted to nationalize their resources and get more pennies on the dollar than they were getting from their own resources. And of course, the democratically elected leader, Mossadegh, was overthrown by an astroturfed revolution that was finally, it was already known, but unsealed by the CIA, I think in like 2013. You can read about it that the MI6, aided by the CIA, overthrew Mossadegh and installed a Shah who was also very friendly and gave us good oil prices, gave BP good oil prices. British Petroleum, the same company that had the oil spill, right? And then kind of apologized to all the people and everything. That British Petroleum is the reason why Iran got essentially the Shah, and then eventually that led. I think the Shah was actually pretty secular, pretty good leader in many ways, but eventually overthrown by an actual Islamic National People's Revolution. And now we say, Iran is so what is it? It's like so crazy, we need to destroy it now for some reason. Okay, and Saudi Arabia next door is literally like a kingdom giving us oil, and then for many years. Now we don't need its oil, so we sell it weapons for the same money that they got for our oil. And of course we look the other way when they wage their war against Yemen, right? Because they are our allies. And so Saudi Arabia is totally cool, and we'll give them nuclear technology, says the Trump administration. I don't know. I think that's really capitalism has its state-backed actors as well. We want good oil prices in Iran, so we help BP literally do a regime change. We want good prices for the United Fruit Company. Fruit. Okay, so we go and engineer a regime change in Bolivia. Okay. I mean, why do you think Che Guevara and others were like, maybe capitalism isn't the best system for us? Maybe because they had to face capitalism. Why do you think the first anarchists, the first libertarians were all socialists? Like Oscar Wilde, who wrote Man's Soul Under Socialism, an essay. Tons of these guys, Kropotkin, Bakunin, Russian guys, were socialists. It's not because they were Russian, maybe, totally, Leo Tolstoy. It's because they were essentially seeing what capitalism did. At that time, the government was the tool of the capitalist, putting down strikes, putting down the workers. Even in the United States, there was a lot of socialist movements. There were even communists here in the 20th century, but there were also Nazis. I think there was like a Nazi parade as well, which was a socialist, nationalist, socialist thing. I don't know. These days, the word nationalist is revived by Trump. But again, I'm just saying that the idea is capitalism is one system that we had in this country, but it's not the only or exclusive way that things happened. The government helped railroads, the government helped build other roads. As I already mentioned, the interstate highway system, the government had an instrumental role in this country for building computers. Silicon Valley was essentially a bunch of orange groves and everything until government funding for microwave research allowed Stanford University and other basically companies to grow around that funding. Intel, was heavily funded, created the Intel chips, created the whole industry of microchips. Then you have the personal computer revolution. A lot of it was private. A lot of it also depended on intellectual property protection by the government. Okay, I'm getting tired of speaking about this. I hope you see that there's a more balanced view, that we have a mixed economy, that the government is involved, but it's not always a destructive force, and sometimes helps propel industries forward. We have computers, and that's why we have the dominance, because Silicon Valley, okay, was able to produce the very things that gave us the dominance, which now China and others may eventually leapfrog us.
According to socialism, would make my house a means of production. There is no point at which private and personal property deviate away from one another.
Okay, private property and personal property is basically synonyms. I don't know what this guy is talking about. I'm sorry. I kind of was excited to talk about socialism in a more way with actual examples and like actual examples of mixed economies and stuff. So I'm sorry. Let's get back to ideology here.
And therefore, the state in a socialist society would ultimately have to have control over everything, since they would have to strictly control how people use their property in order to even attempt to enforce this rule.
Well, look, that may be true if you're talking about state socialism, just like there could be state capitalism, of which I just gave examples. State-backed capitalism. But of course, socialism does not have to be backed by a state. There were libertarian socialists. Literally, libertarianism was rebelling against capitalist and the state capitalists. So we're talking about like early 20th century and 19th century. So, okay, so state socialism is one example. And of course, I would argue that that's not even the best, or it's the most brutal example, because I agree that if the state enforces exactly the price, exactly everything, everyone has to work for the state, that could devolve. In fact, David Pakman literally says, I am not a socialist, in another video, because, yes, although it could produce a lot of prosperity of a kind, maybe not consumer goods and sneakers and 1,000 types of cheeses and 1,000 types of sneakers, and yes, there's not that, but it can produce a lot of things like lifting people out of poverty, giving them literacy, like the Soviet Union did in Uzbekistan, for example, which was run by Muslims. Then the communists came, which were godless communists, didn't have the Muslim religion. But what they did have is women were working alongside men, and they had rights, same rights, and everybody was equal, at least in theory. And then they all had to work, and they all had literacy, and the kids went to public government schools, kind of like they do in this country. Literacy was very high. And then, of course, electricity was brought, and the whole thing, people could have appliances, okay? People didn't have to go to outhouses anymore. They had their own bathrooms and running water. So yes, the United Socialist Union of Socialist Republics actually helped republics like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and many Muslim countries, and like Romania and Estonia. You could look at their GDP, look at Romania's GDP, how it shoots up when it joins the Soviet Union and then goes down after the Soviet Union collapses in 1990. Like, there have been benefits, obviously, to many countries, but also, I'm not here to deny that the Soviet Union had massive repression, especially in the beginning of the revolution, with the Red Army forcibly pretty much plundering and taking forcibly everyone's wealth and killing them if they don't give up their wealth. The class struggle was a violent struggle, and you could see that in China after the Second World War. Mao kind of led a revolution. He was leading it just like Lenin during the war. Lenin led it during World War I. He was kind of like a German, I would say, spy or German, regime changer. Okay, his brother was killed by the Tsar, and he didn't like that one bit. And he was a socialist along with Trotsky. They fomented a revolution that killed the Tsar, killed his family, and took over Russia. They replaced the other socialists with their form of Bolshevism. People before Lenin, there was I forgot his name. The guy before Lenin who was actually running the place for a while. And then, of course, there was Stalin and collectivization of farms, which Mao did as well. There are many bad ideas, but and that led to many deaths, many of them unintentional. many of them genocidal, some believe. But I think more sort of the farmer class was sacrificed at the altar of the city class. Yes, terrible things, and that's why state socialism may not be so good. But that's a type of socialism. There are many other types of socialism, like, for example, and again, that's not social democracy, which is like pretty much every Nordic country, European country, Canada, Australia, they're doing pretty well. That's capitalism. I'm talking about state socialism. There's other forms of socialism, like in revolutionary Catalonia, which was totally suppressed by both the USSR and the West. You could see the workers' collectives there. Kibbutzes in Israel, communes in the 60s, co-ops. I told you, the stock market, the public stock market, is a socialist enterprise because it's literally collective ownership of the means of production. Okay? So, did that lead to gulags? I don't think so. I don't think it's like the best system, but it's also pretty good, and it's produced everything in America that we use today, pretty much.
And secondly, if something isn't private property, then it can't be property, because what defines a commodity as property is having ownership over it. In order to...
Well, yes, defines property as having ownership over it. Exclude others from using it. Sometimes owning something like an idea means others can't use your idea, and that's not always the best system.
Have ownership, you must have absolute dominion over it and be able to control how you associate with it. If you can't exercise dominion over your own property, then you don't own it, which means it isn't property.
Correct. And the shareholders of, let's say, AT&T exercise dominion over AT&T in the way that they elect the board, and the board elects the CEO, and they have bylaws, and they can change the bylaws with a vote, and they can have shareholders hold a referendum, just the same way as the population of a city can elect a mayor, and if they don't like the mayor, then they change the mayor, and they can have a referendum. Okay? These organizations are collectively owned, and I should say managed, because ownership is a loaded word that kind of suggests a bit more than you want. Okay? Just because you own your house does not mean the city doesn't have zoning laws, doesn't mean it doesn't have property taxes, it doesn't mean you can just sell your house if you owe taxes to the city. The city just will put a lien on your house, and the banks which you use to sell things will know about it and will honor it because they care about their relationship with the city. So that's kind of like an interconnected society. Wow, it's crazy, isn't it? Ownership is not always so black and white. There are sort of overlapping forms of control, whether it's property taxes by a city or whether it's rent by Walt Disney World. Okay, just because I own a stall that sells shoes in Walt Disney World does not mean I am have no hired landlord. Having no hired landlord is what's called a loyal title or a sovereign title. It's kind of like what the Queen of England has of some of her property. She can literally kill people on that property and no one can tell her anything because it's out of the jurisdiction of the British police. I don't think the Queen's ever done that, but I think if she does do that, it would be a very murky question of can she be even held liable for it. Countries have sovereign ownership of their land, and that's sort of the same kind of thing. So not everybody has it. They have something called fee simple ownership, which is subject to a higher landlord, but it's a high degree of control. You're allowed to do certain things, but then the democratic society around you or the monarchy, which is not democratic necessarily, could come in and say what you can do with your property and what you can't. For example, if you are a corporation and they have a corporate park and you employ people, there may be at-will contract laws that say you can't have people sign themselves into slavery. No matter how much the both sides agree to it, no matter how much one side says, I really want to be your slave forever, I'm into bondage and I love it, the society around simply will refuse to take that position in a court case. It will not enforce that contract. Many other unconscionable clauses in contracts are courts will refuse to enforce. So when you say that you own something, you're kind of assuming that someone will enforce that property right. that someone will have to have guns, violence, some kind of teeth to enforce it. Usually that comes in a soft power. Taxes are not collected by people with guns typically. They're withheld by the employer who wants to, participate in the rest of the system. They're withheld by banks that garnish your wages because the IRS puts a lien on them, right? So taxes are not usually collected at the point of a gun in the first place, okay? And property is not usually enforced by a gun either. If you owe someone money, they could take you bankruptcy court, and the bankruptcy would also cause a lien against your wages and garnish your wages. Or if you're not paying child support, then the state will garnish your wages through the same kind of systems that they use to collect debts for other things. So again, you live in a society, and the society runs in a democratic way. It's okay. It's okay. This is not like the end of the world. It's literally been going on since the beginning of human society, and some animal societies probably.
Now, this doesn't mean that people can't voluntarily...
In fact, this white wolf probably lives in a society, in a futuristic society that gave him this helmet and everything. And he lives with other wolves, and those other wolves probably produce this stuff, okay? And he looks pretty satisfied with himself, but he didn't build all of it, okay? Some of it was built by people and other wolves that lived before him, and they're dead. And he gets this stuff for free. And if this wolf is an anarcho-capitalist or someone who is jealous of everybody else that gets free stuff in his time, well, guess what? This wolf is getting free stuff, okay? But I don't know. The sky's kind of red. Maybe he survived a nuclear apocalypse or carbon being pumped into the atmosphere, or maybe he just lives on a red planet. I don't know. I could talk about this, but it's not socialism.
Practice communism with their property, that people can't let others use their property, or that people can't even live communally.
Look what just happened. That sky became blue. Okay, they must have a massive technology there. I'm kidding.
No such thing as common ownership, and that everything that deviates away from private ownership must necessarily be theft, since the...
ideology. Okay, look, I've already shown how collective ownership is a normal thing. Employee-owned corporations, okay, kibbutzes are governed, corporations are governed by their shareholders. I mean, those are the ultimate source of the votes. Some of them have non-voting shares, yes, but many of them have voting shares. Literally, this is not hard. People, and I'm hoping that a lot of people listening to this get me. I mean, you guys are smart. This guy's ideological. Many of you are possibly also ideological, and I could be ideological in some cases. But in the reasonable party, we're going to be reasonable. And so I'm saying, yes, collective ownership is a thing. It's been a thing. People can vote on things that they collectively own and have policies. Like in a co-op, like in an employee-owned corporation, like in a shareholder-owned corporation. Okay.
Government can only obtain property through the forceful appropriation of private resources.
Some define socialism as a system by which social equality can be achieved.
Government doesn't always obtain things like that. A government is simply the management team of an organization. The federal government of the United States is a group of people that are elected in order to manage the United States. The United States, just like the EU, is basically a federation. The federation is an organization. It is designed to govern a bunch of states, which are themselves organizations, which are designed to govern a bunch of land, which have cities. And the cities themselves are organizations, or provinces, or whatever you want to call it in Canada. And the cities are themselves organizations which govern smaller units like neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods all participate in electing the mayor. They have constituents, they have representatives, they have different forms of people that are working for you. It's in a representative democracy, which is a pretty good system. Maybe there are better systems out there, but in a representative democracy, you kind of vote for a person and you hope they're going to do what you elect them to do. So that is not theft. That is literally just representation. Just like in a co-op, the building was not stolen from a bunch of residents. It was built and collectively owned from the beginning. Maybe it was bought and collectively owned. Maybe things are bought by a state. Maybe a state could buy, like the Louisiana Purchase, okay? And then people decide to govern it in a certain way. That is not theft, okay? Not everything in the government is theft. Simply, you have organizations because people form organizations. That's what they do. That's how people are able, they're smart. In fact, John Harari, in his book, Sapiens, talks about how people got to today because they have the unique ability to form organizations. Large organizations, which are not rigid like ants, but they're able to change. And so people form these organizations, and until computers came along, guess who we put to manage the organizations? Other people, okay? Those people didn't necessarily steal things, okay? They simply ran for a certain type of job, and they got elected, okay? And that's not to say there weren't empires or plundering in the past. There weren't marauders. Certainly violence existed. And violence is used also to enforce property rights. And violence is used to enforce laws of other kinds. But yes, government is not always theft. Government is simply governing a governance structure of an organization. And people want to have organized society, so they organize corporations, and they organize companies, and they organize cities, and they incorporate those cities and hamlets or whatever, and then you get the commonwealths of cities, and you get the Commonwealth of Virginia, which became a state. This is not theft, okay? People did this pretty peacefully. The non-peaceful part is that they took the land from the natives that lived here, and Virginia and other commonwealths were composed of cities which the colonists would fight the natives and give them infected blankets so the natives would die, because they kind of wanted them to just go fuck off. And the Trail of Tears is an example of natives who Thomas Jefferson, wanted to assimilate, and some of them did by learning the language of the white man, the ways of the white man, the capitalism, the private property, the everything, and gave up their ways of collective ownership and owning the land and having and fishing, whatever, fine. And then they were told by the next president, Andrew Jackson, to just fuck off and leave. I'm using the F word here because literally it was a genocide and many people died along the Trail of Tears. Finally, one of the tribes, which was very assimilated, and their chiefs took the state of Georgia to court and won in the Supreme Court, won to say that the state can't evict them just like that. So what did Jackson do? Well, of course, he found a rival group that basically sold them out, and then they evicted them anyway. They were promised millions of dollars, which they would get upon getting to Oklahoma and other places. But of course, once they got there, I'm not sure if they got the millions of dollars and the tons of land they were supposed to get. There's more land. But of course, shortly thereafter, they got no land. They got put on a reservation, and they got pretty much no money, no land, and they were not better off. So this is the system, right? I mean, it's good for us, and we say that capitalism built this country, but of course, we have a lot of land and oceans, and we don't fight each other because we have a common language. And a lot of that is due to the top-down English empire, and colonies of the empire all spoke English, etc., etc. That's why we have 50 states that don't fight each other and speak the same language. I mean, there was a civil war. There was one time that we fought, but Europe fought like Napoleon and, I don't know, just everything. They fought World War I. They fought World War II. They just kept fighting. The more you fight, the less you achieve. And if you unite, then you have something better. And uniting often involved empires. Anyways.
A broader way of thinking about it, socialism could mean any kind of socialistic philosophies or attitudes or tendencies, or a system that combines orthodox socialist practices with other constructs like capitalism. For instance, you could say that some Scandinavian countries are socialistic by modern standards.
Okay, so David Pakman's making a distinction between socialism and things that have come to be labeled socialism, but she says are socialistic. Look, collective ownership of the means of production is actual textbook socialism. And I've said that even the public stock market is collective ownership of corporations which have the means of production, most of the means of production in this country. So that's collective ownership. But there's also social democracy, which is the proper term. And that is redistributing wealth in a capitalist society to safety nets, to parks, to universities, to libraries, to health insurance, all these things that people need, food, running water, that's social democracy. It is not socialism because it does not involve collective ownership of the means of production. And I've already said, capitalism can involve collective ownership of the means of production. So socialism can be part of capitalism or not. I mean, if you just use the actual definitions of it. But of course, you have people on the right saying Bernie Sanders is a socialist because he wants people to. This is his idea of a great economy: is people standing and lining up for bread in bread lines and having no choice. No, and death panels and whatever else and repressive. No, that's not his idea. Okay, and he's pretty clear. The only thing that I would say is I wish Bernie Sanders would just call himself a social democrat. He is literally just like a New Deal Democrat. Okay, he's literally like the Roosevelt Republican Party. I think 1956, I'm going to say, or 53, I forgot, 56 platform. Republican Party, okay, had pretty much the same platform in a lot of aspects. A living wage, strong protections for the workers, possibly even the unions. I mean, strengthening the family through government. Like, literally, Bernie Sanders is that. Are those guys socialists? Maybe. Are they for collective ownership of, well, so socialism started to mean sort of like this weird thing of like, people get to survive. Oh no, people get free shit even if they don't work, and they get to not die. And they get goodies. Fox News would say, look at these homeless people. They got money with no strings attached. And then they got back on their feet. But look, they have even TVs and they have refrigerators. As if like, wow, they don't deserve those things. They didn't work. But actually they did go to work after that. So sometimes the handouts are hand-ups that people do pay back. And sometimes they don't. And sometimes you have these diamonds in the rough, like the author of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, was on welfare when she wrote it, and then she created $1 billion industry. But if she hadn't been on welfare, who knows? She could have been flipping fries somewhere. Or Jan Koum, who sold WhatsApp to Facebook for $19 billion, a corporation, by the way, a centralized corporation. But Jan Koum was on welfare. His whole family was on welfare, and that allowed him to do things like learn computers and code instead of flipping burgers or trying to survive. Okay, so I'm not saying that we are poorer than the people in the 19th century. Those guys had to work their asses off, and in the 15th century more. And 2,000 years ago, they had to plow the fields and build the pyramids 5,000 years ago. Okay, and the Great Pyramid of Giza was its own economy, and that was probably a very interesting study for archaeologists. Was that socialism? I'm going to say that that was a very centrally planned thing. Okay, but today, we're on the verge of computers and automation reducing demand for human labor. And if that's the case, we need to deal with it as capitalists, as socialists, as whoever. I mean, that's just a fact that computers are able to do things that 1,000 people can't do in the same amount of time. It is a fact that one person can run a factory floor, or 5 people, where you needed 500 people. It is a fact that if you go back here, you see a farm that basically is just 3 tractors instead of 500 people. It is a fact that there's less and less demand for certain types of jobs, and the only question is, will there always be enough jobs for everybody that pay enough for them to pay their rent? Okay, of course, we can be blinded by the fact that cell phones are cheaper than ever and better than ever, and that's true. Capitalism has produced that, and competition has produced that, and across countries. And it is true that, and Samsung and Apple compete. It is true that tons of consumer electronics and consumer goods are cheaper than ever, and that's true, okay? But it's also true that rent, okay, and health insurance and health care is at all-time highs relative to people's wages. That kind of stuff doesn't just come out of nowhere, okay? I wish it was lower, but of course it would be lower if there was a single-payer system that came to a doctor and said, look, we represent a huge amount of patients, like Medicare, and hey, do you want all these elderly to come to you? Well, here's the low price. Here's the price. They get the best price, okay? An individual person paying out of pocket It's not going to get the same price as a collectively bargaining insurance company. And the bigger the insurance pool, the biggest insurance pool is all the people, right? So, there's a lot of power to bring prices down in a monopsony with a single buyer and the sellers competing. So if you want to bring things down, typically single payer systems are a pretty good way to bring prices down. You could, of course, go overboard and put too much power in on the consumer side, but currently there's too much power on the producer side. Okay, the doctors have the American Medical Association, which Milton Friedman back then called a cartel. They call for licensing of doctors and less doctors, so therefore the wages stay high. And lawyers probably have their own cartels and other things. I don't know why law is so expensive. Why hasn't somebody built a site that is open source law, right? Like Wikipedia or GitHub. Okay, so we need single payer systems for the time being to negotiate things down, prices down. Instead, we're pushing for a free market where consumers compete while providers aggregate into these cartels, and consumers are supposed to not aggregate and just kind of be played against each other. Oh, grandma, you could pay more? Oh, come in, I'll do your knee surgery first. Look, that's not going to lead to lower prices, okay? So some things like health insurance, health care, real estate, roof over your head, those things are just going up and up and up. It used to be one person can support a whole family on one paycheck. One person, breadwinner, right? Had a lot of stability in his company, was valued by his employer. No longer. Employers don't need to value people as so replaceable like Amazon warehouse workers, okay? Or eventually going to be replaced by Kiva robots, okay? Uber doesn't care about its drivers, easily replaceable people with their 12-hour shifts. Eventually will be replaced by self-driving cars. Trucking, don't even get me started. Look, people are working for corporations. They're over-medicated. There's the opioid epidemic, sadly. There's depression. The elderly are in nursing homes so people can work. Kids are in public schools so people can work. Kids are medicated for ADHD, okay, which is like the hysteria of our time when you just label everything ADHD, just prescribe it. I mean, it's crazy. It's literally an over-medicated, depressed society that 1/3 of people are working paycheck to paycheck. Many people, somehow, I can't even imagine how this is, have food insecurity. Like 18% of Americans. Food insecurity! I don't get it. And this is supposed to be the best system, and there's no improving it. I mean, we can't learn from Finland, we can't learn from Nordic countries anything. Sweden has a lower child mortality rate. Can't learn from them, they're socialist. Okay, Denmark and all these 10 other countries, single payer countries, have higher life expectancy. Oh, well, we're just the best. Look, we invented more things. Our hospital beds are better. Other countries have more hospital beds per person than the United States. Yeah, but if we have single payer, the doctors, Ben Shapiro says, will never work for wages like that. My wife went to school for 1,000 years, and now you're going to negotiate her salary down? She's got to pay off her loans, man. Okay, dude, in other countries, the single payer countries, you have more doctors per capita. So riddle me that. How is it that it was the opposite of what's predicted? Because in the real world, sometimes some ideologies don't match the facts. And when it comes to religion and ideology, you can either look at the data, look at the facts, and change your model, or you can just say continuously that, nope, our model will eventually work. Keep trying the same thing. I know socialism has never worked, apparently. Communism has never worked. Okay, communism has never been achieved. And I agree that socialists have been saying that we haven't achieved true communism, and that's why we could do even better, even though I would argue they've achieved a lot with literacy and electricity and getting people from out of poverty, grinding poverty. But they say, we haven't achieved communism. And that's fair. That's an ideological extreme. And so on the other side, you have people saying we haven't achieved the perfect free market, and that's why our health insurance premiums are so high. And that's why we pay the most in the world. Once we achieve a free market, suddenly we're going to pay the exact great price that everybody is supposed to pay. Once we have a free market, no one will live paycheck to paycheck or whatever. They're going to be the best they can be, and the rent will be affordable. Look, okay, It's a fact that when people compete on one side and on the other side they don't, the single payer system speaks with one voice, then things go in the direction of the collectively bargaining side, okay? So there's power in numbers. I mean, that's a thing, power in numbers, okay? So collectivism doesn't always fail. It actually often achieves better prices and better terms than had you not banded together. Anyways, this is like pretty obvious stuff, but you hear the same things on the right, where you have, okay, trickle-down economics. It hasn't worked yet. We can measure the trickle. Every time we cut the taxes, we do the same insanity over and over. It doesn't work. But hey, there's always a reason. 2006, it almost would have worked. It was working 2004 with Bush, and the government was in trillions of debt. But, there was the Great Recession. That's the reason why the tax base shrank and the government went into further debt, trying to bail out the private sector. Oh, I see. So once it did that, and the private sector is now doing well, it's doing really well. Okay, in 2014 and 15 and 16 and 17, the markets are growing, starting from before Trump. Don't you think it's time to pay down that credit card, public sector government? Don't you think it's time to tax and pay down the debt? Trump goes, no, I like to live large. I love to live large. I've always lived large. So what? I know my casinos have declared bankruptcy, but I wanted to build the biggest casinos ever. And I always just rev that engine to the max because it's me. I want to build the walls. I want to put my name on the walls. Listen, Trump, if you let Trump name things after him, highways, bridges, he would build them. He would be the biggest socialist you've ever seen. He would make the government the $1 trillion infrastructure plan that Bernie wanted to do. Trump already said, right after Bernie dropped out of lost the primaries, Trump picked up that policy of his, the $1 trillion infrastructure plan, because that's a big builder project. And what does Trump like to do? Big buildings, big building projects. So of course Trump, he used to be a Democrat, would be a socialist if he could put his name on it. And Bernie even said, hey, if Trump, we just call it Trump Care. Call the single payer system Trump Care, and he would be for it. He would go against his own party and just try to promote it. It's kind of true. So there's no left, right, socialism, or whatever. There is just sort of ideologies. And actually, Trump is a big government ideologue. He would march the army through Chicago and send in the feds, he claimed. And he would do a lot of things if he could. He would love to make a national healthcare system if it was named after him. Right? He would love to build giant walls between every state, maybe. Oh, probably not that. That's a little going too far, because the United States of America, the unity is a source of American strength, okay? And maybe if we ever annex Mexico or annex one of these other areas, we'll demolish those walls. But in the meantime, Mexico is the place where we export the drug violence, and the gangs run that country. And we don't care. We care about ISIS, because ISIS is the dangerous group, and of course the Zetas and Sinaloa cartel that run cities for decades. That's just, we got to have the drug war. Anyways, so Trump would be a big centrally planning socialist spending person if all you had to do was put his name on it, Mount Rushmore. He would make that project. He's like FDR. He is like FDR, a populist. FDR was a Democrat. FDR put Japanese into internment camps. FDR would not allow Jews to come to the United States and turned away boatloads of Jews during the Holocaust, or leading up to the Holocaust, because I think at the time people were afraid that, if you read the Smithsonian, the Jews were Nazi spies. Some of them could have been Nazi spies. I mean, literally, that's what Trump has done with Shiite refugees from, Syria. Has a single Shiite terrorist, blown something up in the United States? You read about Shiites, and it's Shiite terrorism is different than Sunni terrorism. They're known for, defending their state, or, doing targeted assassinations for Iran. It's every country does that. So you're saying Sunnis are not religiously motivated, they're just politically motivated. Shiites. Shiites are not religiously motivated in their violence, but they do the same violence that you do and everyone else does. So why are you afraid of Shiite terrorists, for example, or Sufis, who are like these sort of Kabbalistic, mystical Muslims? Yeah, you're really afraid of them with their dances and their... whatever. So he's like FDR. Like, Trump is literally the big building, big spending, xenophobic, sort of interesting president. And he does some good things. And FDR did great things. He was reelected 4 times. But he's also the guy that turned away Jews before the Holocaust. Okay? And he's also the guy that put Japanese into internment camps. So, yeah. Like, this is not left or right or Democrat or Republican. These are things that run throughout the political spectrum.
Not because they have a system where the government or workers own everything, but because they have a system where there's a relatively greater amount of intervention by democratic government to protect socialistic ideals like egalitarianism, civil rights, equal education, environmentalism, and the prevention of abuse by actors in the free market.
Well, which one is it? Is the market regulated by the state, or is it a free market?
It's a mixed economy. The market is regulated by the state. The public stock market is heavily regulated by the state. The corporations have quarterly earnings calls. They are very heavily regulated by the SEC and what they can say. Just ask Elon Musk, who tweets at night, just like Donald Trump, and sometimes gets in trouble, just like Donald Trump, but is a rocket scientist, not like Donald Trump.
Are you not even thinking about the words coming out of your mouth right now?
No, I think that's you. But again, that's fine. Ideology blinds people. You're clearly an intelligent person, but is also a very self-assured person who thinks that he knows everything. Hopefully, this video where I'm off the cuff, literally showing you tons of actual, real-world examples and breaking them down for you and showing you the patterns will convince you that maybe your ideology is not explaining everything. Perhaps there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, that are dreamt of in your philosophy. Thank you, Shakespeare.
Now, because you just contradicted yourself within one whole sentence.
No, that's literally just called a mixed economy. Markets can be regulated by the government and still have market participants who make individual decisions.
Socialism is an extremely broad umbrella term to describe a wide range of political, social, and economic systems, movements.
You know what I like is that David Pakman has production values with an actual producer who puts all these icons on the screen. And all these icons represent different movements within socialism, and they're kind of cool. This guy has a wolf, which I don't know. I hope it's open source, dude, because intellectual property guys might go after you. So I hope this 3D model is actually open source, by the way. But I'm not going to go into that.
And ideas.
Anarchism is not a socialist philosophy.
Are you kidding me? Anarchism is not a socialist philosophy. Please continue.
Can be, but anarchism is merely the rejection of all political authority or unjust.
Okay, to be fair, he said it can be, and it was. Most anarchists, including Henri Proudhon, okay, who, by the way, Pakman mentions, and others, Bakunin, Kropotkin, they were literally socialist anarchists, okay? In this country, there were many socialist revolutionary anarchists. You don't hear about them much today. One of the best-selling books in the 19th century and towards the end of the 19th century was, ready for this, Henry George's Progress and Poverty. Henry George was an economist who asked the question, how is there so much progress and yet still so much poverty? And he advocated the one tax, which Milton Friedman called the least bad tax, which is the tax on the unimproved value of the land. I'm not going to get into that because I'm really getting tired of explaining all this, but you can research all this yourself. It's very interesting. It was a bestseller. Everyone from Leo Tolstoy to U.S. presidents to Milton Friedman to others knew about this book. If you buy this book, on the back cover you'll probably see a lot of testimonials from a who's who of world leaders. Okay, but today it is hardly known at all. You should go read it. It's like Piketty and Capital in the 21st Century talking about rising inequality is like a footnote to that book. It's like the same problems rehashed, but like explaining that it's still happening. Okay, And like the prescriptions of Henry George were like, do a land tax. So yeah, like these are not left or right things. They are simply things that people observe and then try to present solutions to. And if they are conscientious and intellectually honest, they will look at the data and try to see how their solutions stack up in the real world. Maybe look at, little examples, laboratories of democracy, laboratories of capitalism and socialism. See what works in Finland, see what works in Sweden, and copy that. Because that's what we do in every other area of life. So yes, anarchists. Many anarchists in the past were living under a heavily capitalist system and a feudal system sometimes. And they said that anarchy was essentially the rejection of the dominion of feudal lords and employers over other people. The rejection of hierarchies where a person would basically just be subservient and meek and live in someone's house just so they can survive and raise their children.
Justified hierarchy. In favor of voluntary cooperation.
Let's explore where socialism comes from, some of its variations, and how...
Just want to say, voluntary cooperation is an example of what happens in Wikipedia, open source, science, and other things, where people have just enough money to live, like a scientist who does this postdoctorate, whatever, and he gets a stipend and his tenure, and then he's free from worry, finally, okay? It's like being financially independent in a capitalist society, which is like increasingly fleeting for many people. And so then they're finally able to like work on science and open source and raise their kids and research philosophy and religion and like take care of their elderly grandparents, whatever. And that's why Medicare, okay, and other safety nets free people up to do things and live healthier lives. So yes, voluntary cooperation requires redistribution of wealth. That is not necessarily the same thing as central planning. And it's not necessarily the same thing as socialism. It is social democracy.
They functioned in society. Some elements of socialism have ancient roots. Ancient Buddhism taught that the individual and all other living beings...
Okay, some elements of socialism have ancient roots. So here's the thing. Socialism is a word that was coined in the 19th century. Okay, Marx and Engels also lived in the 19th century, and they talked about communism and Das Kapital. Mostly talked about actually capitalism and the contradictions of it. That was mostly what Marx wrote about. He also analyzed how the natives lived in many countries based on secondhand reports. And he was inspired by that. But socialism is essentially a word coined in the 19th century, so to ask where has socialism worked throughout history, I mean, literally people lived in tribes and societies were organized in a top-down way with the pyramids and Egyptians and just the Mayans did this, obviously with the pyramids. People didn't have that much, so they relied on economies of scale, public bathhouses, public works projects. Obviously, people fed off the teat of like government projects. Government was just, they formed an organization and then they ran that organization and they built public works, which they used. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but hey, did they have socialism? Well, let's see, collective ownership of the means of production. They didn't have that many means of production, man. So like, okay, so elements of socialism were there obviously throughout history, and David Pakman says elements of socialism. To that you say what?
Beings are interconnected and interdependent, and that all humans should be treated equally and with kindness.
Which is a metaphysical principle and not an economic philosophy.
Okay. A metaphysical principle and not an economic philosophy. Like, read the Talmud, okay, which is a compendium of Jewish writings in the first millennium AD, okay? Read the Talmud. It is basically, and before that, Jews had oral traditions. So there's a lot of like price regulation and like you shouldn't charge too much, and there's like prohibitions on usury, which the Christians had also. There's tons of stuff, man. I mean, elements of socialism. Again, this is not socialism. So there's social democracy, okay? Then there's socialism, which is collective ownership of the means of production, which is producing stuff. And then there is like price fixing and all this stuff. That's more like social democracy, okay? So let's keep those two things kind of separate. We're talking about social democracy. David Pakman said that socialism has been stretched as a word, and now he's talking about elements of socialism. And you treat this as a straw man that he's still just talking about socialism.
People often draw parallels between socialism and Buddhism, and many say that Plato's Republic first articulated the notion of a socialist state, a state that aims to solve social problems by government action through...
I don't like David Pakman's examples. I mean, this, I agree, is literally a fictional work of a hypothetical society, and here the author of this video actually does a really good job of attacking Plato's Republic, which basically said that some people should advocated eugenics, and like some people should be nudged to have babies, and those babies could be raised by the state. This is at a time, of course, where Sparta was literally a society that raised people to be in warrior classes, and like actually were well known throughout the Greek-speaking Hellenistic world of being valiant warriors and defending people. But again, this is a different time period, and sure, Plato's Republic may have not been a real thing, but of course Athens was run democratically by at least some of the population, and many societies obviously had public works. Like who built these stairs? Okay, do you think private enterprise built these temples and whatever? Dude, like obviously people banded together to build these works in a very sort of publicly owned way. They were open to the public and collected dues. So yes, there are many elements of this, okay?
Higher taxes and redistribution of resources.
Plato's Republic is not a real society. It's a Socratic dialogue written by Plato to describe what an ideal society would be like according to him. And it's pretty obvious that you've never actually read Plato's Republic, because Plato clearly outlines that his ideal society would have 3 state-enforced classes of people: producers, auxiliaries, and guardians, and that people assigned to these positions must perform that position and only that position. And in Book 4, Plato clearly outlines that...
By the way, I did read Plato's Republic, and Plato's Republic starts out by examining the human body, and how the human body, when we talk about what's the perfect human body, it has different parts and different things, and therefore Plato took his inspiration from that. Whether or not you want to follow Plato's Republic, I mean, I will make this aside that Karl Marx also, like Plato, believed that children should be raised in communal environments, communally, where Karl Marx argued that people would preferentially treat their own children, so we shouldn't know who has what children, so that essentially there would be more equality of opportunity, I guess, for the kids. It's an interesting concept. I'm not saying it's wrong. Like, okay, we have public schools. Like, literally the kids are spending most of their time with the teachers, right? And the teachers, they're not the kids of the teachers. So literally in this country, we have the kids taken away from the parents. But of course, the parents voluntarily give the kids away because they have to work for the corporation. So they put in a giant daycare center that purports to teach them, but is really just preparing them to work for that same corporation. And by the time they grow up, the corporation won't really need them because they'll have robots doing a lot of the work. But whatever. The point is, the kids are being put in public school and raised by not their parents. So we kind of have a Marxist, Platoist system already in our society. And if the kids don't like it, well, there's always ADHD medication like Adderall or Ritalin. Continue.
That his ideal society would have a market economy. Not just any market economy, but one where money is used by everyone to fulfill their own base desires specifically.
There are lots...
Yeah, pretty much very similar to the economy that we have today.
Lots of other aspects of Plato's Republic that don't at all align with modern socialism. Socialistic ideals are seen being portrayed in the Hebrew Bible, which in many places says that people should be treated equally and that we should be generous to the have-nots. The book of Leviticus...
I just want to say again, this is social democracy. This is not collective ownership of the means of production, which was obviously how people built the temples and built the things and the public infrastructure, because guess what? Either that was built by the king, okay, who raised taxes, which you call socialism today, or it was literally people putting together their resources in order to, say, defend themselves and build a giant wall so that marauders would have to get over the wall and they could defend themselves. Literally, people would pool resources and collectively own, I guess, certain structures or castles or whatever. And then those castles would eventually be taken over by a marauding army who would then govern them differently and take over the population either as slaves or, if they were nice, giving them other things. And some were very nice, and some spread, like Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan, spread and united many people with a common language, etc., etc. Okay, continue.
It says, you shall not oppress or exploit your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. Deuteronomy says God enacts justice for orphans and widows, and he loves immigrants, giving them food and clothing. That means you must also love immigrants because you were immigrants. Don't take advantage of poor or needy workers, whether they are fellow Israelites or immigrants who live in your land or your cities. From Ecclesiastes, it is God's gift to humankind that everyone should eat and drink. From Psalms, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy.
Here's the question. Is this an individual command? And I'm asking sort of David Pakman and people on the left. Is this an individual command to individuals to give charity? So if you see a weak, needy, fatherless person, an orphan, do you help this orphan? Do you make it your personal mission to take this orphan into your house and help him? Maybe yes. Maybe you give the orphan a job. Maybe you marry him off to your slave girl or servant girl or whatever. There was not much distinction back then. Servant, slave. Okay. So there was some. Jews would not enslave their own people for, there would be a worker, but then he would go free after 7 years. Not so for the other nations who would be working among the Jews. But of course that was a different time. People had less resources. Even ancient Romans had way less, the average ancient Roman, than people today, right? Their kitchens were outside. They didn't have kitchens like we have. Right? But they didn't have air conditioning. So the question is this a command to the person only? Or is this a command to the society? Okay, in Deuteronomy, you're supposed to give a loan to a person by the gate. This is the charity, and the loan would have to be forgiven every 7th year and every Jubilee year. Okay, every Jubilee year, the land would return to the ancestral ownership by the father. So no one could sell the land in perpetuity; it didn't belong to you. This idea that nothing in nature really belongs to you was a very Jewish idea, just like it was a Native American idea and every other thing. This whole thing where you can't just own the land forever. It belongs to God. Okay? The earth is God's. So God gives you the land and you can sell it, you can rent it, but you're not the ultimate owner of it. It's an idea that I built this and I have sovereign ownership is a non-Judeo-Christian idea. So you've got these sort of tribal economies where the ancestral tribal homes, tribal lands go back and they can never be sold in perpetuity to a Gentile or to another Jewish tribe. So you have that. And now you have essentially a constitution. You have essentially the first democracies, the first constitution also. The Sanhedrin and the Jewish people were democratic. The elders, where they would have, it was said that the foolish or the latest, the youngest would speak first, the latest joining people. So they would not be swayed by the more elderly senators, Sanhedrin speakers. So it would go from the first people to speak were the youngest members. Sort of a democracy, and at the same time it was the tribal leaders that. It was a representative democracy. So one would say that the Torah and the Bible, and especially the Torah, was addressed to the nation when it was talking about the king having, the Torah with him and having to learn all the laws. These laws were a combination of individual responsibility, but also national responsibility for the weak and the fatherless and the widow and everything. So, when the prophets talked about why Israel was plundered by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians, they often invoked the fact that it perverted justice. Let's say they said that the widow and the orphan didn't get their day in court, and society didn't give them essentially good social protections that they were supposed to get. There's a lot in the Torah for individuals to give 10% of their land, but of course, who enforces that? Who enforces that? The society, right, would enforce a lot of the laws, right? And many of the laws were not economic, of course, and they were also enforced by society. There was no jails as much. There was either you got stoned on the spot, or you got fined, or you went home and whatever. There was no real incarceration. I'm not sure in the United States if it's a better system to have the biggest incarcerated basically society on the planet. 25% of all prisoners are in the United States. And some of the crimes are pretty crazy. We say that Iran jailed a woman for representing other women with headscarves. And that's a victimless crime, sure. Right, we would say. I mean, Iranians would probably say it's not a victimless crime because it promotes promiscuity or something like that. In this country, we jail people for all kinds of victimless crimes. One could say 80% or 85% of people in the jails today have harmed no one, really. You cannot point out a person, okay, they crossed a border, or they were detained because they used a drug in excessive amounts, or they sold possibly a marijuana to someone that arguably did not harm them, or they sold alcohol. I don't know. So you go and find out, why they were put in jail. Parking tickets, yeah, maybe they harmed the driveway owner. I don't know. But we have the biggest incarcerated group of people in the world, and we always look at others. It's easy to criticize others and say, look, you put your people in jail. I don't know if it's a better system necessarily, because it's a pretty violent system in the jails. You get anally raped if you're a man. I think the women attack each other too, in lesser extent. People get killed, people get assaulted, and they can't get out. And if they do get out, they can't get a job, and then they get recidivism, they go back often. I don't know. Anyways, so these systems, I think, were social responsibility for the people. And of course, poverty leads to a lot of crime. So the less poverty you have is actually better for society. But I'm going on a rant. And this is only tangentially related to socialism. Continue.
Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Now, this might get awkward for anti-socialist Christian conservatives, but the New Testament is also chock full of socialist themes.
It's funny how you say that socialism is specifically collective ownership of the means of production. Then you go on to point to all these vague references to charity and sharing in religious texts or philosophy as examples of socialism.
No, he literally said that socialism has been stretched by right-wingers, including on Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, and all the other commentators everywhere on the right, to basically to label whatever they consider to be any public goods or any public programs that they don't like to be socialism. Literally, when they are confronted and told that Medicare is a single-payer system, they say, well, come on, I mean, we're not talking about that. Well, yes, in one instance you're not, and in the other instance, when it's convenient, you are. You're literally confusing your users by conflating social democracy with socialism. And that's one thing I actually don't like about Bernie Sanders, is he calls himself a democratic socialist. Democratic socialism is essentially non-revolutionary socialism. So there's no Red Army that's going to come and confiscate the wealth, but the ultimate goal is socialism. I don't know if Bernie wants the ultimate goal to be socialism. I think he likes aspects of socialism. I think he was more socialist in the 70s and 80s when he praised Moscow for the subways, the clean subways. And certainly he recognized that things under socialism, many of them were good. He praised Cuba for its healthcare. There are videos of him doing this. But I think he's mellowed out over the years, and he should admit that he's pretty much a social democrat. For example, he does not ask for Detroit to be nationalized and for the car industry to be under the control of the government. But I think he likes the fact that the government bailed out the auto industry and gave taxpayer money to do so. I don't know. Actually, nope. I'm sorry. Nope. That's not Bernie Sanders. Because that wouldn't make any sense, would it? Bernie Sanders would not want taxpayer money to bail out giant corporations, whether they be banks or whether they be Detroit corporations. Nope. Bernie Sanders would have liked those corporations to stop doing what they're doing and the unions to actually get living wages for people. I'm not sure if Bernie Sanders has a good response to how cars should be produced. But Bernie Sanders is not about collective ownership or takeovers of corporations. Bernie Sanders is about making sure people have a livable wage, just like Teddy Roosevelt, just like Eisenhower, okay, who were Republicans. So Bernie Sanders, okay, is for universal health insurance, just like many Republicans. Like Medicare is supported by tons of Republicans. Even universal health insurance is now supported, single payer, by many Republicans. Okay, this is like the rest of the world has these systems. So Bernie Sanders is more like a New Deal Democrat who likes Nordic countries and their capitalist systems, which also take care of the poor. And that, don't even get me started, but China literally has a socialist system, which, you know, it has socialism with Chinese characteristics as their official thing. The Xi Jinping thought, okay? Just literally Google that, Xi Jinping thought, right? They have leaders that literally help centrally plan the economy through their personal views on how socialism will evolve. And China simply admitted that, yes, we need capitalism markets to build up wealth. But we're going to guide it and centrally plan the cities and all these giant projects. And it's paid off in the last 20 years. I mean, the largest number of people ever in history, 500 million people at least, have been raised out of poverty. Similarly to how the USSR did it when they didn't have electricity or literacy. And then the USSR brought that. But of course, with that comes repression and political repression. So there is less free speech in China. There is less economic freedom in China. But to say that there is less progress, I mean, China, literally the wages have increased 25x in 20 years. Literally China's science, China's artificial intelligence, China's roads, China's infrastructure, even China's treasuries have experienced a tremendous boom. And who knows, 10 years from now, this video has been recorded, China may be the dominant country in the world. Now, they certainly have more people than the United States. But to say that China's system of socialistically sort of coming in, top-down, doing these things, is worse. And to say that FDR's system, never mind he was a nationalist and, you know, xenophobe or whatever, but his system of top-down, interstate highways, building, it brought up a whole industry of trucking and McDonald's and malls and all that stuff that gets delivered to your house gets delivered because of that government investment. To say that the market would have done it. I mean, it had decades to do it. To say that in Africa today, China's approach is called soft power. That's their idea, that they come in and help Africans build their own local bridges, their own local factories, their own local infrastructure, and Africans learn Chinese. And it spreads Chinese culture to Africa and around the world. Just that soft influence and soft power versus, let's say, capitalism. De Beers diamonds coming in and making Africans sell their diamonds to De Beers diamonds and creating this artificial scarcity, just like with intellectual property, okay? Or bitcoins or whatever. Bitcoin is like the De Beers diamonds of like cryptocurrency. Think about that. But like De Beers diamonds is like this artificial scarcity. A diamond is forever. Buy it for your engagement. Buys diamonds. Pay a lot. Pay 3 months' salary because that's the norm. They put it in everyone's head. And then the African people, different African nations, literally have to fight for the diamonds. And there's warlords. Just like with drugs in Mexico or whatever. Warlords. And that's capitalism. Or how about the ivory trade with the elephants, like in the 19th century? Oh, we have piano keys. Look, the Chinese support this. They have capitalism too. Chinese have a black market for the ivory trade because, hey, you get a bigger erection. They have these ideas about how ivory and other things can help. The horn of a rhinoceros can help. I mean, that's exploitation, and Africans would kill each other. Never mind the elephants themselves, right? That's capitalism and exploitation. Is that necessarily always better? Certainly, learning the language is better. When Teddy Roosevelt went and took over the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, they can now work on cruise ships, let's say. I've went to Norwegian cruise lines. I've seen a lot of people from the Philippines speak English to me. That's more opportunities for them. But are those opportunities because they speak English? Yes. They could have learned English without necessarily exploiting them. But to be fair, everybody that speaks English has a better chance of going and speaking English in other countries. Syrian refugees could have gone to Arab countries. And Arab countries, many of them, should have taken them in larger amounts, instead of Europe having to step up and do it. So, yes, Russians would have taken in Russia would have taken in Russians, different Arab-speaking countries should have taken in Syrians. But that's what empires do. The reason that our Arab-speaking countries are all speaking Arab is because Islam spread throughout basically the region, and Arabic, which is what Islam was written in, is the same reason why Latin was spoken in Europe, right? That's the same reason why in Morocco, the Berbers and everything, there's the Berber language and then there's Arabic. Why are people in Morocco, Western Africa, speaking Arabic? Why are people in Persia speaking Arabic alongside Farsi? Why are people in Indonesia speaking Arabic? Because of the Quran, right? Because of variations in the Islamic religion. It united people. So religions serve to unite people. Empires serve to unite people. Languages serve to unite people. And that helps people. Whether it's communist or socialist or whatever the economic system is, or a mixed economy. That is what creates opportunities for people. Shared culture, shared foods, shared language, shared, ideas and desires.
Using the definition of socialism you're trying to correct people for using, while trying to explain to them that socialism is something different entirely. Talk about a confused message. But to be fair, arguments which come from cognitive dissonance tend to be broken and tangled in logical errors more.
No. To be fair, he said that this is not socialism, and socialism has been stretched. And then he said elements of socialism have been present in different societies. Literally, like the Native Americans had communal ownership of land. And literally, they didn't understand when they sold Manhattan for like $20. Okay, they didn't understand. They didn't even purchase from the right tribe, by the way. But whatever. Like, they didn't understand. When Columbus came and he forced them to work for gold, and he literally, like, his men would chop off their fingers or their ears to, like, force them to get the gold. Like, they had a different society. They were nice to Columbus. And that's not to say every single nation in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, was nice, right? I'm not saying that the Aztecs were nice when rivers of blood were flowing down their temples from their human sacrifices, any more than the Vikings were nice, or the Druids were nice with their human sacrifices. I'm just saying many of them had quite socialist, centrally planned, or communal economies. And in fact, Karl Marx and Engels were inspired by secondhand accounts of those exact things. So no, I don't think that socialism has never existed or never worked. I think it's actually communal ownership and cooperation has been pretty much the norm in human society. I think it's capitalism and this idea of private ownership exclusively has been this mantra of it's sort of anarcho-capitalist with this like idea that eventually, just like communism, eventually a free market will arise, a perfect free market free of government intervention, a total anarchy, anarcho-capitalist utopia. Like Lysander Spooner is invoked when he didn't like the post office or the Constitution of the United States. He is invoked. And when asked, how will the property, like the air or the water or the land, come to belong to a specific person rather than us all, how can that one specific person remove it from being available to everybody? Or like an idea. How can someone own an idea suddenly? They say homesteading. It can be homesteaded. The word homesteading was coined by John Locke. And if you actually read the real John Locke in his actual writings, the same John Locke says right afterwards that homesteading is the mixing of labor with nature, and so that person essentially gets first dibs on whatever, the plant is being produced, okay? But then, of course, John Locke says that a person that owns too much land is misusing it. If he lets the vegetables rot in the fields, then it would have been better if multiple people would have actually not would have administered that land and not allowed such rotting in the fields to happen. Just kind of like with food stamps, maybe food stamps were initially created by the U.S. government because the economists literally said we saw a giant chasm, a gulf between food rotting in the fields on the one hand and people starving on the other hand. And we decided to create this currency that will buy the food rotting in the fields before it rotted and give it to the people who were starving. So they fixed a market failure. According to anarcho-capitalists, market failures never exist. It never can happen. If food is rotting in the fields, then that must mean no one's hungry. And if people are hungry, well, I don't know. I guess that means they're just lazy. No, dude, like, the food wasn't getting to the people, and the system fixed it. Like, that was stated by the people that started the SNAP program, the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program. Like, that's literally, no one lost from that initially. In fact, the effect of welfare on poverty across the world, just Google it. There's a Wikipedia article that shows every country, pretty much, it had a massive effect. Now, afterwards, there was diminishing returns. Obviously, the more you run the war on poverty, the less effect you have. It's never going to go to zero, just these measures. But it went down by a lot. People today are less poor than they used to be. People that couldn't eat can eat. That's pretty cool. They can feed their children. You talk about IQ in Africa is like lower or whatever. Dude, like Africa, okay, malnutrition is a major component of IQ. Poverty. There's studies that people lose poverty. They lose IQ points for just being poor because they're often consumed with these things that rich people don't have to worry about. Like, am I going to pay this bill or that bill? They constantly have this anxiety that interferes with, like, doing stuff. And they can't take as many risks. Like, if Paris Hilton's CD, which she put out, fails, no big deal. She's still going to be bailed out. When Ivanka Trump, or hey, Donald Trump, when his casino fails or something else, his dad comes in and buys $1 million or $3 million of chips. Or when his casinos start failing, the banks come in and help him restructure his debt and give him more money because he's too big to fail for the bank. That's nice, isn't it? So the banking system provides a giant safety net for people who bank with them. But regular working Americans, they shouldn't have a safety net. I mean, so they are able to take risks. And those risks can pay off, like Harry Potter, like WhatsApp, were done by people that could afford to take some risks. Imagine what Americans could do if they were able to take risks instead of working in dead-end jobs that will eventually be automated because they can't afford to switch and learn something in college and take classes. They just can't afford it because they're tired from 10 hours of working.
More often than not. So while this is bad argumentation, it's not a level of terrible that's completely unheard of.
Actually, that's what I would say about this video. I'm having more fun explaining all these related topics, and I hope to have a discussion with you, and I hope that we learn something, and I'd like to learn more things. I'm open to more data, but like, this is ideology. It's not open to more data. Like, yes, he's saying, show me these things. Like, I have shown you these things. My video is 10 times longer than yours, and I'm not proud of it, but I am proud of everything I'm stating is specific. It is examples. They're broken down, and I'm not running away from them and retreating into ideology. I won't say that there will be less doctors in a single-payer system, because the facts show there are more doctors in many single-payer systems. Okay? I will not simply throw around words like death panels and rationing when in America there's infinite wait times for the people that cannot afford the health care. I would not say that there is no way to allocate resources without prices, when I know that there are ways to allocate based on need and urgency. I mean, these are basic things. And everybody, including the author of this video, can understand them. I wouldn't be surprised if the author actually commented below and actually said, maybe I learned a few things, and yeah, there are tons of examples, and maybe my ideology is a bit narrow. So it's not the worst video, and I see that he has this logic, this rigid logic, but this logic's like divorced from actual examples. He's just not aware of all these examples of collective ownership actually producing wealth or managing things well. Like, it's fine. Like, one person owning a company, like Michael Bloomberg, still owns his company, like with a few partners, whatever. That's one way. And then like AT&T is owned, or Thomson Reuters is owned by a bunch of people. And they're fine too. So it's fine, dude. Like, people have organizations and there's many ways to govern them. And the world is like complex and we try different systems. Maybe you should look at Finland and Switzerland or Sweden, see why child mortality is so low there compared to this country. Why is it so low? Could it be that they have parental leave and the parents can take care of the children? Could it be the fact that childbirth, if you have a complication, it's practically nothing to take care of it because the cost is socialized? People, you still have to pay for these things. Daycare, whatever, food. What do you think? There's no free lunch. Just because you're not paying taxes for food doesn't mean that you're not going to buy food. Just because you're not paying taxes for food doesn't mean you're not going to eat. You're going to eat, you're going to pay, and you're going to compete with every other Joe Schmo who needs to eat too. But if you all paid into one organization that collectively bargained and had the power in numbers, strength in numbers, you would actually have food costing less. Just like Amazon is able to squeeze publishers. Just like Google is able to squeeze website operators. Just like Apple is able to squeeze app developers. Because when you represent a lot of customers, money talks. That volume, people make it up on volume. So yes, a free market does not always get the lowest prices. Obviously, this is basic supply and demand economics. Continue, please.
The term socialism itself wasn't used until the early 19th century in Western Europe by philosophers and social critics like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Henri de Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen. At first, the word was used not to describe any one political system, but as an abstraction, a philosophy that societies could or should operate to serve the collective, as opposed to just thinking about the individual. This,
by the way, is so precise. I mean, every word, he obviously looked at this. I'm not sure if he's reading this off the screen or whether he really thinks this precisely. But I would say that David Pakman is pretty much a physicist or mathematician of politics. I think that when it comes to cracking a joke or whatever, he and Ben Shapiro may not be the most playful of people. But when it comes to clearly stating things in a very rational and calm voice, like he does, he's really has my respect. So to take his words and to strawman them and to ignore what he just said and to sort of try to say that he's an idiot loser, no, he's literally saying to you that socialism was sort of this set of ideas that then were put into this word eventually that's used now and has so many different meanings. But the textbook definition they gave right up front is the collective ownership of the means of production. Now, having said that, the socialist libertarian movement and ethos has been around since the 17th century, 18th century. John Locke, as I said, he said that there's a thing you can own too much. Who's the other patron saint of the capitalist? Well, let's say you've got The Wealth of Nations. Okay, in the book of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith writes about the invisible hand in only one place. That word, the invisible hand, I believe is mentioned maybe once or not at all. In another book, he does mention it. But in The Wealth of Nations, I believe he says that the rich are basically like they could have eaten everything in the field, but because of their biology and everything, they're not going to eat everything. So they are led as if by an invisible hand that nature has pretty much given to everybody, including their peasants and everything, as much food as there would be if everyone had their own little plot of land. So Adam Smith basically advocates for everyone to have their own little plot of land, their own little business, and not have an employer-employee relationship like a corporation. Again, he writes about so much more. He attacks mercantilism and all these other things. But one of the things he basically advocates for in his idea is that people own their own little businesses and have a business-to-business relationship, which is much more respect, like a consultant, rather than an employee. And of course, in his time, there were feudal lords and the peasants and everything. So, but he's saying that even in the feudal society, as if by an invisible hand, the feudal lords are essentially eating only as much as a human can eat, and therefore everybody else gets to eat the rest of the field. And it's pretty much it equalizes in the end, however it's distributed. So, he's basically saying that capitalism, or whatever system, is okay because it brings about equality, at least in consumption of food. So even Adam Smith is a proponent of equality and considers a priori equality to be a good thing. So it's very interesting that even the patron saints of capitalism, whether Adam Smith or John Locke with the homesteading, literally wrote in their writings the virtues of equality and not owning too much. But again, that's if you read their actual writings and not just say Wealth of Nations and invisible hand, market. So yeah, it's like you're using their ideas, homesteading, without actually reading what they said about those ideas, which is fine. It's almost like intellectual property theft.
In the wake of the French Revolution, and in large part a reaction to the poverty and inequality that was growing out of the Industrial Revolution.
You have that entirely backwards. The Industrial Revolution was innovating and creating competition, which got people out of poverty.
Well, yes and no. Like so many other things, right? Like in mixed economy, both are true. Like in the Talmud, you're right and you're right. How can they both be right? Well, you're right also. That's actually the Fiddler on the Roof. Look, the Industrial Revolution eventually produced a lot of prosperity. Eventually, technology always produces prosperity by reducing the amount of people that need to work, by increasing the amount of output that each person can make. And that sometimes reduces the demand for human labor. And so people are paid less. Sometimes people respond by working longer hours in the factories and in the fields, like we saw in the Great Depression, and many other places. Okay, there's obviously all these conditions that we see with the coal industry in London, with all the smog, and you see these movies of Oliver Twist. It's like, may I have some more? I mean, he's an orphan. There are orphanages. There's poor houses. There's things that the government tried to do for the poor, until they realized we can just give them money. We can just give them vouchers and they can choose their own doctor. Like Social Security, before Social Security, elderly people were destitute and they worked until they dropped dead, unless they had family members that could help them. Orphans were pretty much under the protection of the state or orphanages run by the state or whatever. Or maybe run by a private organization or a church. Like, look, I mean, orphans and widows and all this stuff were things, right, that the Bible wrote about. So The Industrial Revolution, and this is what capitalism does, yes, it produces a lot of wealth through competition. And I have said that competition may not always be the best creator of wealth. Permissionless innovation and collaboration may be better, like with the web, like with Wikipedia, like with science. They are way better. The web is better than AOL. Okay, Wikipedia is better than Britannica, arguably. Bigger, more topics, produced more. Linux runs on more types of computers than Windows. It runs on toasters. It runs on space stations. Okay, and science is probably better than like private alchemy of like hidden knowledge. Okay, or the Gnostics or whatever. So like, yeah, open source, open knowledge, open permissionless innovation with no ownership of ideas may be better. So one might think that it might work for drugs. One might think that collective ownership of resources, at least forget collective ownership. How about no ownership, no exclusion of people, that everyone can have some amount of water, air, and maybe even their rent and health insurance, a few necessities of life, the Maslow's pyramid, taken care of. Maybe that society would be way more productive as people collaborate, not because they need to build a profit, not because they're worried about survival and build up a nest egg so they could survive for the next few years, but because they want to contribute to science, because they're curious, because they're intellectual, and they actually have more intellectual honesty. In capitalism, you have to hide from your employees how much you're making so they don't realize that you're skimming a bunch off the top, maybe like 200% off the top. No, in that kind of industry, literally you're just contributing because you have free time and you literally just want to make the world a better place. You can fix a bug in a software program. You can discover a new scientific thing that no one else has done. Maybe you can even put your name on it in this giant tapestry of names. But there are no heroes. There's no Mark Zuckerbergs of Wikipedia. Okay, maybe there's this guy who started Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales, and this other guy. But like, there's no glory, okay, in being author number 22, who's like editor number 25, toiling away and rejecting different things. You're doing this because you care and because the time you're spending, you don't need to sell to a corporation to eat, okay? So it's a different system. It's not socialism. It's permissionless collaboration, which I believe to be superior to both socialism and capitalism in creating wealth.
People who point to the Industrial Revolution as a grim point in our history are either being overly anachronistic in comparing modern working conditions with those of the 19th century, which is flawed because of innovation and technological advancements which have made production cheaper, less wasteful, and have improved working conditions.
Yes, technology and innovation and science that it's based on is what improves the lot of humans. What economic system leads to improvement in science is up for debate. There are many economic systems, and we live in a mixed economy that tries different approaches. Sometimes you have public funding for drugs and prizes. And then you have the patent system. We have private funding, and it's a winner-take-all thing. I don't know what's better. In science, usually it's the public permissionless innovation that wins. So I would expect that to be a better system. But that implies that people have enough to eat, so they have disposable time, just like people would have disposable income in capitalism to spend on things. People have disposable time to spend on taking care of their children and raising better, well-adjusted children, better behaved, well-adjusted children.
They also never seem to question the reason why people are leaving the countryside in favor of urban areas.
See, that's a good point. People did leave the countryside in favor of urban areas. There's different reasons why. Like I said, during the Great Depression, there was simply not enough jobs in the countryside because that stuff was automated. There just didn't need to be enough people there. So people needed to seek other jobs. And those jobs didn't exist until you had to build the factories. And then there was a giant war, so everybody got to build stuff for the war. Anyways, but even after the war, there was a lot to build. The factories were there. And then we had all these revolutions, manufacturing, computers, etc. So people left the farm for many reasons, but one of them is they got automated. People didn't just leave the farm and suddenly there was less production of food. Clearly that food was produced even after they left, which meant that less people could do the same output that previously more people had to do, which meant that things got automated. Okay, so that's one thing. You still need the food to be produced. Clearly, less people were needed. That's why people left the farms. So, yes, the Industrial Revolution would seem that also that is a specific thing, like combines, like technology, to actually, like the windmills, I don't know, the technology to do this. You don't no longer carry the water from the river to your house. You have a irrigation system, a sink. Do you really think none of that existed in the 18th and 19th centuries? Those things existed that brought the water to the crops. So obviously you needed less people. I mean, that's also a big factor.
Because back then you had the choice between backbreaking labor on a farm or backbreaking but slightly safer labor in a factory. There is a reason that since the Industrial Revolution, the world population has skyrocketed and the average lifespan has more than doubled.
Yes, there is a reason for that. Let's talk about that. The population skyrocketed because child mortality was solved. Lots of children died before. So people kept having children at the same rate as before, but less of them would die. That's why we have this. Okay? Also, the Malthusian trap. So we're able to survive and we make more children because we're able to survive. And so then we have more children. And eventually, of course, we run out of some resource. This can't continue forever. So what is that going to look like? A world war, a giant famine, a virus killing off people? I don't know. But hopefully it looks like condoms, or it looks like Planned Parenthood, maybe without abortions, maybe what is it called? When you prevent conception, right? Anti-conception. I forgot. I'm getting tired. Contraceptives. Okay, so Republicans should actually want to give out free contraceptives, especially if they're against abortion, if they want to avoid this among the poor. If they say the poor should not be given handouts, then they either will die or essentially try to collectively bargain for food, or they will have to have less children. By being better off, by educating women, they have children later in life. And actually this starts to taper off in every society which is richer and allows women to go to college and have careers. So that's good for society, because the more people, the more garbage, the more pollution, the more use of resources and farmland. And we have tons of pollution in the world. Plastic pollution in the oceans. All the fish are eating the plastic, then we're eating the fish. All the carbon pollution, all the everything pollution. So the less people there are, the richer everyone will be. There'll still be enough, the same amount of food, same amount of robots, same amount of technology. So this is what makes people more poor, argued Malthus, a Christian minister who said that people need to, control their sexual urges and be more moral. He talked in this time. Now here, this population growth happened because child mortality. Same thing, ditto for the
skyrocketed, and the average lifespan has more than...
The average lifespan counts all the child mortality. It's not that people used to live until 30 and then drop dead, and now they live until 70 or whatever. No, the average lifespan is like 80, whatever, because less children die. How about that? Okay, cavemen did not all live until 30 and died. Even cavemen, let alone elderly, wise men in every nation of the world. Of course people lived until 70 in their 70s. However, many children died. So again, child mortality explains this as well. If you remove child mortality from the equation and you just look at life expectancy, it has actually risen by maybe 10 years. And we could push it, and I think we will push it in the next few. I really hope that there's a lot of breakthroughs coming with Aubrey de Grey and all these life expectancy things where it's talk about the breakdown of your DNA and retroviruses and everything. But that's a video for another topic. Here we're just talking about life expectancy. We've solved it because we figured out about bacteria. We figured out about C-sections, that women that died in childbirth and their child died in childbirth, we could do now C-sections and save those children and save those women. That's pretty incredible. Actually, look how many women died. Women would die in childbirth, men would die in wars. That's another thing. Wars. There's a lot less violence. Read Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. People used to kill each other back here a lot more. And they would kill each other even less here. And even with the First and Second World War, they killed each other less. Today, it's laughable. Like, we talk about 200 people getting killed, and that's terrible. But literally, like, duels were happening in the 17th century every other day. Okay, people were killing each other. Knights were fighting each other, jousting, and people were dying from, like, typhoid disease and the Black Plague and whatever. Okay, so yes, technology. Life expectancy increased because of technology. Not capitalism necessarily. However we got the technology and medicine, and C-sections were discovered, and Pasteur discovered bacteria, and just everybody sort of contributed to this growing snowball. Again, collaboration in science. People had stipends from tenure at university. When you're financially independent is when you get the biggest contributions from people. Perhaps it's time to make everyone financially independent. We're certainly wealthy enough now to do that. And at some point, when there's enough robots, even you will admit that it's okay for people to get free stuff eventually.
Doubled. The means of production will then be controlled by a proletarian state, which in theory will lead to an egalitarian, stateless society that governs itself without coercive institutions.
Yep, hyper-totalitarian statism will lead to the state just sort of going away, according to Marx.
Yeah, and how do you actually want the state to go away? I don't know if you're an anarcho-capitalist, but anarcho-capitalists keep wanting the state to go away. Here's what they don't realize is that the state already went away in many areas where previously we needed humans to be in the loop. For example, the post office. I needed to mail something and I needed actual couriers on horses to go and deliver that parcel. When there was a battle, I believe, in the Civil War, was it the Civil War? Yeah, I think some battle was fought 2 weeks after the war ended because they didn't get the message in time. I mean, then they invented the telegraph. That's technology. And suddenly messages could be sent by private entities without the post office. You don't need no Lysander Spooner, man. And then they got FedEx, and then they got constant competition. And I agree. Thanks, Steven Crowder, for pointing out that the competition pushed the post office to improve. But the main point is that we have email and we have technology. We used to have newspapers. Now we have desktop publishing and printing. We used to have Smith & Wesson gun makers. Now you can 3D print your own guns. You have blogs instead of magazines. You have Craigslist instead of, classifieds. Things that used to be centralized in the hands of a few outlets are now in the hands of everybody. And there's another sort of socialist idea called distributism. And it was a Christian idea in the 19th century where people talked about distributing the means of production into everyone's hands as much as possible. And that's what technology has achieved. Literally anybody can desktop print pornography in their own home and distribute it to their friends if they wanted to. Literally anybody can create a website permissionlessly on the web. And unlike AOL, they can't get kicked off so easily. And in the future, there will be encrypted end-to-end decentralized systems where no one, including governments, will be able to take down private speech, which they won't know who's saying what. It will all be in a giant cloud of encrypted stuff. At that point, governments will give up on policing free speech in bulk because it won't be feasible with the encryption. Instead, they will go back to their previous methods of planting moles in organizations in targeted ways to try to find out what's happening, as they did in the United States with the McCarthy era communist organizations and socialist organizations, as they did in the FBI when they did COINTELPRO, where they infiltrated and different organizations to prevent socialism from taking hold in the United States. The state has long been against socialism in the United States, and in the USSR it was the other way. The KGB would infiltrate all sorts of organizations which presented, in their opinion, a threat to the state. The KGB literally stands for the Committee for the NSA, basically, the Security Agency for the Nation, for the state. The National Security Agency. Okay, so they literally, the KGB is literally the NSA if you translate the words into English. Of course, it was slightly different. The KGB is not the NSA necessarily, but they did have moles, and they couldn't do bulk collection of everything, except through the mail maybe. So they had to place moles. And these moles were basically just people in the organization who would report higher up what's going on. And the rival things that they thought were a threat is like Islam, Judaism, Christianity, as well as different capitalistic ideas. So they would suppress those. Every country would suppress rival ideas. Our whole thing is Western liberal democracy. That is what we like. And I like it. I was brought up on it. And I think really it's a good system. But of course, free speech could lead to things like radicalizing regular Muslims to join ISIS, and young men who may have ideals could see a video. That is free speech. Or a gunman who goes and shoots people up because of something he read on a site and participated in an online community. So there's that, and of course there's always this question, and again that's the subject of another video. But with China, the Chinese Communist government currently sees even Christianity as a threat, certainly sees Falun Gong or Falun Dafa as a threat, which is a peaceful religion pretty much, with practitioners never committing any terrorist aggression against others, but it's treated way worse than even the United States treats Sunni Islam, or even Wahhabi jihadist type of Islam, I should say, even jihadists, okay. How? Well, the Chinese government cracks down on Falun Dafa by all kinds of extrajudicial kidnappings and sometimes re-education camps, and I did not witness any of this personally. I just followed online and researched both sides, and both sides are very adept at their propaganda. Both sides, it's weird. It's Falun Dafa is a religion that is online posting about the atrocities of the Chinese government, but also the Chinese government sends a bunch of people to then post that Falun Dafa leads to people setting themselves on fire, which, by the way, Buddhist monks do that, and by the way, it's self-immolation or mutilation and not hurting others. But still, okay, and of course it's anti-gay, the Chinese government says, but then again, Russia's government is anti-gay, and it's the government. I'm saying anti-gay like anti-gay propaganda, meaning the Russian government is against free speech when it comes to promoting that it's okay to be gay, or homosexuality, as they would say, or for example, Russia's government just starts to censor the internet. So governments and civil liberties are subject of a different video. But yes, sometimes having state control of an industry can lead to bad things, as David Pakman admits in other videos, like Why I Am Not a Socialist. Literally a video that says, Why I Am Not a Socialist, which you probably didn't watch, Mr. Author of this video. But again, there is a danger of that, which is why I'm not in favor of socialism, state socialism, but I am in favor of permissionless collaboration with less ownership, which there should be a different word for it, like open source or science. So I think that is a system that's better than both capitalism and socialism. but it requires people to have disposable time, which means they have to be financially independent enough to not die by contributing a lot to science or Wikipedia.
Marxists really are that fucking delusional.
Really important point here. This is not what the Soviet Union or its, quote, communist successors achieved or were.
Okay, so here's David Pakman is talking about the Soviet Union and its quote-unquote communist successors like Mao Zedong, or like Kim Jong-il, or like Stalin, or Che Guevara, or I guess anybody, or Fidel Castro. Sort of these revolutionaries became leaders. They started controlling an entire state. And so the state apparatus, including secret police, including the KGB, including the like the Cheka, and the sort of the people that would put rich people in jail and try to extract as much money as they can from finding where they buried that money, which some of my own family was what is the English word for this? In Russian, it's called раскулачивание. It's opening up the fist and taking what the guy is like holding in his fist. Yeah, and they would call the rich people kulak, the people that like take the fist and like don't let go of like their property. So that is the revolutionary sort of socialism, and I will call that socialism if there's collective ownership in some sense of the means of production on farms and everything. That doesn't always lead to good things, but better ways of socialism is when you can buy a share in a company and have collective ownership of the means of production.
Were working toward, despite their pretenses. Bolshevism, Maoism, and the like are inherently right-wing, totalitarian perversions of.
Now here's where I disagree with David Pakman. He did not define what it means to be right-wing versus left-wing. I would argue that these communists were in fact left-wing. They were left-wing communists. For example, they believed in the brotherhood of nations. They believed in the what is it? Not the Marseillaise. The Internationales. So it's like all the countries had like a translation of this. International, which was like a French sort of song. You can hear the French sort of, it sounds like the Marseillaise a little bit. Yeah, so like it was an international brotherhood of working people. It was more akin to like the international brotherhood of like Islamic believing people or Christians or whatever. They basically said workers of the world unite, right? Or like Jews of the world unite. But you have nothing to lose but your chains, right? So leftists, they are not xenophobic. They are not there to make divisions among races or among sexes even. They are simply saying all humans are equal, and what our enemy is artificial class structures. So let's flatten out the class hierarchy. So that is leftism. That is part of leftism. All the anti-war people on the left are anti-war because they believe that the people we're bombing are just as much human and people as ourselves. Whereas a right-winger, like a Nazi socialist, was a right-wing socialist, would say that gays and, well, I wouldn't say, well, let's put gays to the side. He would be xenophobic. They would say Jews and gypsies are, well, first of all, Jews are very smart, and they have to be exterminated because they're perverting society. They have these racial ideas. Gypsies, let's just exterminate them because they're like dirty or like a blight on society. There's Untermenschen with like the Slavic people, the Poles. They could just like mow them down. And, you know, Stalin over here was very happy to occupy Poland also. They were less brutal than the Nazis. the Katyn massacre was a massacre, but it was nothing compared to what Hitler did in Poland. All the extermination camps with Treblinka and Auschwitz were in Poland, many of them, for Jews. And also Poles were killed. So there's the Untermenschen. Sort of look at all these guys. Now the Aryan race is sort of the master race that Hitler liked and favored. He also respected the Chinese a lot, and he wrote good things about them. But like the Aryan race, of why I said Iran is named Iran, because they sort of were flattered by this idea. That's part of it. I'm simplifying. But again, right-wing socialists exist, like the Nazis, the National Socialists, but these guys believed in the brotherhood of nations. They actually united Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and all the other stands into a USSR of Soviet Socialist republics, and they did spend a lot of money giving them electricity and promoting literacy and building universities and getting women to have rights and to have the same rights as men. So, yeah, like that was their ideals, though they were left-wing. But of course, some of those ideals were also, economic ideas were pretty terrible, like when Mao and Stalin decided, hey, let's collectivize the farms, and let's reject all the foreign aid that is coming in when people started starving, and then recognize how much the collectivization hurt the production. They would just make sure that the farm produce was collected and shipped to the cities. And they didn't really value anymore the farm producers and the workers. They thought they were cheating. They were morally corrupt. When in fact, other things happened, like, for example, the people reporting were incentivized to over-report because then they would be commended and promoted for over-reporting how much they produced. And if they were over-reporting, of course, how much they produced, then the state would simply, the allotment for the people to live shrank and shrank. Because, well, they thought they were stealing, because here's how much, you're saying you're producing this many bushels of wheat, where's the wheat? So they didn't count on like all these incentives in the hierarchy. So these are actual problems with the economics and collectivization of farms, and that's true. Just like there are problems with centralized planning of Google or Facebook. But there's also economies of scale, and again, these guys were leftists, and so I disagree with Pakman here. This is the one thing I actually disagree with Pakman. To call them right-wingers is silly. Yes, they were against gays, just like Hitler was. Although they didn't kill them, they suppressed it. But they weren't outright xenophobes and had racial theories. They actually suppressed racial theories. Like Stalin actually suppressed sort of genetics. Okay, lots of geneticists were put in jail because he didn't like their theories of eugenics. He didn't like their theories of IQ, which that's later. They call it. He and Lysenko, who had weird ideas about genetics of plants, would suppress geneticists because they believed that genetics was used to promote eugenic propaganda about races. They're very much for equality, which is a leftist thing. Leftism is more about equality of opportunity, equality of dignity and respect, and having everybody have a roof over their head and not have to lower themselves to like subject themselves to another human being just to survive. That's leftism. Right wing is kind of the opposite of that. And so, yeah, like they were leftist and they tried many ideas that led to deaths of people, but also capitalists were doing things that led to deaths of people. We just don't talk about it. Like exterminating the natives of North America and South America and taking their land. Like that is a genocide. Bigger than the Stalin one. And that was capitalist. They just didn't respect how the Native Americans had their collectively owned land. And they kind of wanted to build their own colonies. They were God-fearing Christians, and they just saw that these natives were a real nuisance. And I'm sure from their point of view, many of them thought that the natives were murderous. And that's the subject of another video of how small groups of people radicalize the other side, and that leads to wars. But at the end of the day, it's not just socialism that had left-wingers that had a big human toll, but the right-wingers, including right-wing socialists like the Nazis, like the fascists, okay? Fascists were, in many ways, socialist. There was just a different type of socialism where fascio, where you had the bundle of sticks, and they said the bundle, the fascio, was the sort of stronger than each individual stick, right? And so there were these like the collective ownership where government and corporations almost merged, and that was the idea that the state was primary. Those were fascists. They were right-wing socialists. Okay, so socialism is just the collective ownership of the means of production. There could be good ideas, there could be bad ideas. Capitalism is about leveraging private, concentrated wealth and ownership in the hands of a few. And whether that is distributed through many levels of society or whether it's owned by one person like Elon Musk or something, or Mark Zuckerberg, who ultimately calls the shots of Facebook, like whether that happens or it's collectively owned by a group of people, that's capitalism. So I guess in some way, to cap this off, capitalism is sort of concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few. Socialism is more about collectively owning things, voting, and putting management teams that you can fire and replace in charge of these things. So I see the future as being neither of these. I see the future as being crypto, end-to-end encrypted, permissionless, no ownership of like the whole platform. People own their own little things, their own little activities, their own little chats, their own little clubs, and no one knows what goes on in those clubs unless you put a mole in there, unless you have a member in there. And that's the future, and I think that government will adapt to accept this, just like they accepted desktop printing, and that's just like they'll accept 3D printing of guns, and just like they'll accept, and then so they've accepted Xerox copiers and email and, you know, private websites and everything else. I think that's the future, and we see that future with open source and science. And in that future, people will just have free money redistributed to them by whatever society they live in. And they will choose how to spend their time. And they'll probably stop putting their kids into public school as much, and they'll spend more time with their own kids and with their own parents. And they will make their own arrangements. That is liberty. That is consensual human association and relationships. And your time is your own. And you have, so that is socialist libertarianism and voluntarism. They are compatible. But I don't like to call it that. I like to call it simply safety nets and collaboration. And I think that's the future, safety nets and collaboration. All right, let's finish this out.
Of Marxism.
Yep, that was a good ending, baby.
So, now not only are the actual real-world examples not true socialism, but they are right-wing perversions of socialism.
Well, no, they are left-wing totalitarian perversions of what socialism could be. Socialism could be entirely voluntary. It could be, for example, a commune, a co-op, an employee-owned company. It could be, for example, a kibbutz. It could be, for example, a corporation owned by shareholders who voluntarily purchase shares in it. Collective ownership of the means of production. all those things are pretty much violence-free. All those things have led to an increase in wealth in that system. Are those the best ways to organize humans and capital? Who knows? But they are pretty good. Collective ownership is not sort of this weird thing that has been tried and always fails. It is normal. It has been there throughout history. It didn't always have all the characteristics of socialism, but certainly all the temples and all the pyramids were giant government or societal projects that were collectively financed, and either coercive taxes or something were distributed towards those public works projects. And so was the Hoover Dam, and so was the interstate highway system. And if you look at China today, or Africa, where China is building the same kind of stuff, you'll see it happening today. These are not bad ideas. They are not terrible ways of organizing people. Literally, corporations are centrally planning how things will be produced in the United States. And they are collectively owned by the public. Not the whole public, but some of the public, a lot of the public. So, yeah, that's pretty fine. I'm not saying central planning is always going to be the best way, but it certainly had a good run. I mean, we're on YouTube that was bought by Google. You're talking on Facebook, which bought Instagram and WhatsApp, and will continue buying different things. Keep using Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon. Keep buying from Amazon. And, you know, there's a reason why these companies have the biggest market caps. Because they're tech companies. And the ratio of human workers that they have to pay to the amount of money they can take in is actually very small. Facebook has one engineer for like 1 million users. So that's the future, and I think eventually that will be decentralized, just like AOL was decentralized with the web. And can we quit talking about socialism versus capitalism and start talking about other things like collaboration versus competition? Do I want encyclopedias to compete against each other, or do I want one encyclopedia that is open to be edited by everybody? What's better? I don't know, but it seems that Wikipedia produces a better result. Do I want AOL to be competing against MSN, Microsoft Network, and CompuServe? Or do I want the web, a permissionless system with protocols of client browsers and server, HTTP servers? Or do I want email? Do I want a proprietary Twitter, or do I want email, which is a system of protocols that you have email clients and email servers? You know, what do I want? Proprietary systems of corporations and governments? Or do I want autonomous systems that are end-to-end encrypted? I think the future is the latter, and this is beyond socialism and capitalism. Both socialism and capitalism, and proponents of them, have made claims that have become outdated, I believe, in the 21st century. In the 20th century, it was true that your employer valued you. And if you had the skills, your employer would employ you for decades, give you a stable job, job security. You could pay for your whole house in one paycheck. You could retire with dignity and get a pension from your employer. Capitalism. That is no longer the case today because of automation and outsourcing. You could see that with the gig economy, temporary jobs, the wage stagnation, the overwork, the over-medicated everybody in the system. Okay. Then you have socialism, which says that if the workers unite into unions, they will collectively bargain and they will be able to get better wages. This is kind of a Bernie Sanders. This is why he thinks that he is a socialist, because he is for unions and stuff like that, collective bargaining. So the problem with that is the socialist thinks that there's power in numbers. But if your skills are no longer needed in such amounts, it doesn't matter if the farm hands would all unite. Because if you can have 3 people with a bunch of machines do the whole thing, you can fire all those people who are demanding $15 an hour or whatever. Get 3 people that are willing to not join the union, and then give them the machines. And the factory floor can be run by machines, and the self-driving cars can be self-driving. So if you think that there was a way that horses and oxen could have done something to collectivize, let's say they were intelligent and they would collectivize, when cars were invented, no. Those horses lost all those fields, and they were turned into parking lots, literally spaces for cars. So humans are now in essentially the position of the horses. Essentially, their services are no longer required in such amounts. But the humans still need to eat, just like the horses. I bet you there are less horses today alive than there were in the 19th century. My question is, how will the people eat when their services are no longer in demand as much? How will the people learn those new skills that they're supposed to learn for supposedly the new environment, as if computers won't be able to also disrupt that? How are they supposed to take the time off from their job when they have to work more hours just to stay in place? The Red Queen theory. How are they supposed to do that if they don't have a safety net? Whether it's universal basic income or health insurance that's universal or food stamps or whatever. People will need to be secure, financially secure, before they are going to contribute a lot of their time to science or taking care of their kids or open source or anything. But I believe a society of people, maybe like a Star Trek type society of people, that have their basic needs met, that know that they have food coming the next day, the next week, the next month, are going to have higher IQs. They're going to be well-rounded. They're going to have kids that are better behaved, have family values, are not raised on the street because their parents are working for the corporations all the time. The kids are going to be taught that they can do what they would like to do and what they're interested in, instead of being put into these rigid categories, these curricula that they have to learn this because that's what the employers want. That's a future that's going to come whether we like it or not, whether we're ideologically opposed to it or not. Just like free speech is going to come when we have end-to-end encrypted clouds where no one knows who's saying what to whom. It's going to happen just because it will, because there's the technology to make it happen. And it's around the corner. The same way, we are going to have universal safety nets for everybody, and people will collaborate. And that's beyond socialism and capitalism. But that's not the conversation we're having today. It is a conversation that we could have if we were reasonable. And that's why I think we could have a reasonable party. Soup's on.
Somehow individualist, huh? I don't know. That one was actually so insanely stupid that I realized that the rest of the video he doesn't even attempt to debunk the argument his video claims to. So I guess I'm done.
That's nice. I'm done too. I hope I've delivered a lot of content in this video. This was one shot, no cuts, no takes. This is me just trying to address the socialism versus capitalism, the left versus right nonsense that we're stuck in, while our planet is getting more and more polluted, and we need to really figure out sustainable ways for our children and grandchildren to live in a society where they're rich, healthy, and happy. Till next time, let's have a conversation.